span, if we look at the span of the relationship between Africa and China, you know, from the acceleration and the creation of mechanisms through which that relationship was managed from the late 1990s, I think you'll see that relationship has evolved and changed over time, reflecting both the particular priorities of China itself in terms of its own developmental trajectory, but also most certainly of the African continent. And now with the potential that the African continental free trade area presents, I think certainly from an African perspective, it's important for us to really reflect and see how we can make this work in developing our own, well, not developing, but certainly building up our industrial capacity, which has been one of the areas where in Africa we've spoken often about, but still battle to really develop an integrated industrial space in which we can add value to many of the commodities that we produce. I'm gonna stop there. The first session this morning after the keynote will be discussing and presenting a paper that my colleague Dr. Lauren Johnston has been working on for some time. The Hunan model. It tells the story of the evolution of the way in which China is also looking at engagement with Africa. But this is also a broader, of course, discussion around the relationship. And in that regard, I'd really like to thank the people who have, and the colleagues who have agreed to participate, and those of you who are here and online, and I'm certainly looking forward to a very stimulating discussion during the course of the morning. So let me move on, and I hope I've done this in 5 minutes, yes, more or less. So let me move on to the first item on the agenda, which is our keynote address. It's really a great pleasure to have Ambassador Gert Grobler here with us. I'm not going to try to remember how long I know you for, because that reflects badly on both you and me. But Ambassador Gert Grobler is one of our senior retired diplomats from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, from which I think you retired about 8 years ago.
16, 2016.
So for 7 years ago. Yeah, my math's not very good. He's been a senior diplomat for over 40 years, or nearly 40 years. 3 of his most recent postings as ambassador were in Spain, in Japan, and in Madagascar. I think certainly in Madagascar, an important position from the perspective of some of the challenges in the domestic sphere. More recently, and I think equally importantly, he spent some time in China, lecturing at the Zhejiang Normal University in Jinhua, China. I apologize for my pronunciation. I'll leave that to my colleagues who have the right intonation. For those of you who don't know, Zhejiang Normal University has an institute for African studies. We've worked with them in the past. They were designated, I think, many years ago, or not many years ago, but certainly about 10 or 15 years ago as the point for academic, or the hub, the lead for academic exchanges and think tank cooperation with African institutions, and certainly in that sense a very important university in the context of China-Africa relations. Obviously, he has lectured there on South African foreign policy, South Africa-China, Africa-China relations. He's now back in South Africa. And I'm looking forward to a book of memoirs, Gert. A tell-all. It's a work in progress. If we can provide any assistance to make it more quickly a completed work. But it's really great to have you here, Gert, to give the keynote, and also I think importantly reflecting not only as a diplomat but also on your time in China. Which I think, apart from what one lectures, also gives one a better sense, a tangible sense of where the relationship is going. So over to you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And thank you for not pursuing the number of years we've known each other. But thank you very much to Saya for this much appreciated invitation to come and talk to you about, I think, a very important topic and a very timely topic pertaining to Africa-China trade relations, and particularly, I think, the way forward. It's indeed a commendable initiative. I think from the outset, one can say that it is encouraging to note that over the last few decades, Africa and China's long-standing friendship and cooperation have indeed grown exponentially, and delivering mutually beneficial and fruitful outcomes across the board. China's trade, and I'm sure you're all aware of that, with Africa has risen 20-fold over the last 2 decades, with China. Sorry, I just want to get this thing going. Oh, sorry, there we go.
It's one of those.
Okay.
You could
Don't know.
probably just try to set it
Okay.
that it doesn't have to do with that.
Let's go with China's trade with Africa has risen 20-fold over the last 2 decades, with China currently Africa's largest trading partner, probably over the last 14 years. Further, as Africa tackles the consequences of growth, whether this is in trade, energy supply, healthcare, logistics, industrialization, China will remain central to Africa's development journey. That is a fact. China will continue to create huge new opportunities for African countries in the process of China's economic development, growth, modernization, etc. It is therefore important that we take stock, Elizabeth, at today's event of the progress that has been made and the challenges that this relationship face in order to inject further momentum into bilateral cooperation in the interest of a mutual benefit. The next phase of closer cooperation between Africa and China is, however, taking place against the background of a rapidly evolving political and economic international landscape, from shifting global balances of power, an imminent Cold War, lingering post-pandemic economic recovery, all these which creates a great deal of uncertainty, unpredictability, and even military conflict, and many new challenges on multiple fronts, which will increasingly necessitate closer strategic coordination between China and Africa on a bilateral as well as on multilateral levels. If one looks, and I don't want to go into all this, one could talk about this a whole separate seminar or seminars. If one looks at the current pressing global politics and geopolitical tensions, issues such as the global economy, climate change, the migration of people, digitalization, the conclusion one arrives at is that they are all more and more interlinked than ever before. The Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, recently stated that if he had to select one sentence to describe the state of the world, he would say that we are in a world in which global challenges are more and more integrated, but that the responses are unfortunately more and more fragmented. And if this is not reversed, it's a recipe for disaster. In other words, there is no other way to deal with global challenges other than through coordinated global responses and organized in a multilateral way. In fact, this is an approach that both Africa and China support. The global I can just add that the global multilateral system is not functioning properly. In fact, one can say it is broke because, and it needs, we'll have to have a look at the beefing up of the international multilateral system. And South Africa and the developing world often talks about that, the need for reform of the United Nations. If one looks at what's happening in Ukraine and in Russia at the moment, it is very clear that the current system is inadequate, or has proven its inadequacy in dealing with this major crisis and to fulfill its mandate. But this is an issue which I'm sure that also in a BRICS context in the months ahead, we're going to hear more about. African countries' effective participation in the ever-evolving international trade and environment remains central to boosting the continent's growth and development. The World Bank recently suggested, I thought, a very sensible approach to bolster Africa's market access in the current global trade environment. They said, first, look inward to deepen regional trade integration. Now, this is happening. We will talk about the free trade area. Secondly, evaluate and re-engineer trade with traditional partners in the US, European Union, etc. And thirdly, strategically diversify and expand trade with Asia. Now, those, in my view, are a couple of very important suggestions. I think there's a very strong emphasis, not only expanding, but also diversifying, which we will come back to. Against the background of shifting against the background of the shifting geopolitical landscape from a unipolar to multipolar world, with worrying statements that we see made, for instance, at the recent G7 summit inter alia, that, quote, China is the greatest threat to international peace and security, unquote, with threats of decoupling, threats of delinking. China and the US now effectively run the risk of entering a new Cold War. Most African countries, however, reject the narrative that doing business with China is to Africa's detriment. Africa would in fact like to see the US explore ways of collaborating and merging development efforts in Africa with countries in the regions like China, the EU, India, Japan, etc. Let me move to Africa and China, the current economic situation, because I think it's relevant to the future economic expansion, cooperation between the two. Although Africa continues to make progress, although Africa continues to make progress, underdevelopment and poverty remain major challenges. And one can almost say that although poverty is generally declining globally, it is not the case in Africa. So much so that many countries in Africa, and there are a lot of documentation on that, shows that many countries in Africa are set not to achieve the objectives of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it's a very sad issue, but it's something. And I think it's also an issue that one of these days we will have to look at what happens after 2030. How is the development, human security, how is all that going to be taken forward? The challenge of the growing divergence between Africa and the rest of the world is reflected in Africa's marginal role in the global economy. In 1960, Africa accounted for 3% of the global economy. 60 years later, that share has increased to roughly 4%, despite the fact that Africa's share of the global population almost doubled from 9 to 17%. But the African Development Bank recently said that Africa's average real GDP growth rate for 2023-24 is projected at 4.1%, which according to them will surpass the global average of 2.9%. Incidentally, a forecast which the IMF concurs with. African economies, by and large, remain resilient in the face of dampened growth prospects and rising debt levels. African governments will therefore have to sharpen their focus on good governance, macroeconomic stability, domestic revenue mobilization, debt reduction, urbanization, infrastructure, agriculture. I'm listing them all of them. All of them are there. Despite many negative predictions and doomsayers and doom prophecies regarding China's economy, the UN, in its World Economic Situation and Prospects report as of mid-2023, it was launched in New York on May 16, projects global economic growth to be 2.3% and revised up China's growth forecast from 4.8% to 5.3% for 2023. In fact, other international organizations and agencies like the World Bank, they are predicting 5.6%, the IMF 5.2%, have also revised up their 2023 growth projections for China, which demonstrates confidence in China's development projects. I quote what the IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said recently. She said the Chinese economy is expected to contribute about 1/3 of global growth in this year. And also she alluded to the opening up as a basic state policy by China as a strong catalyst for reform and development and a key driver of economic progress in China. So, despite a lot of challenges, there are a lot of issues. One reads about the property market, flagging economic growth, youth unemployment. One reads about all of this. But I'm of the view, and I think there are many, many analysts who are of the view, that China's economy's strong resilience, its ample potential, and its vitality, that the sound fundamentals are still there and will not change. And it will continue to sustain China's economic growth, particularly in the longer term, as well as that of world economic recovery. It is therefore inevitable that China will actively continue to be a provider of much needed economic dynamism and a key driver for inclusive and just global governance. I actually just saw a figure by UNCTAD yesterday, where UNCTAD stated in this week that FDI, incoming FDI into China in 2022, grew by 5% to the record of US $119 billion. This was an UNCTAD figure from yesterday. So it shows that a lot of these doom prophecies, I'm not saying that China is not facing certain challenges, but I think the basic fundamentals remain sound. Let me come to Africa, and then Africa and China. In mapping Africa's emerging trade landscape, it is important to note that over the last few years, Africa has increasingly become the center stage for geo-economic competition by major economic blocs. I think one can say that if one looks at how countries are zooming in on the African continent, including the US more than in a long time, particularly under the Trump period. And that the reason for this renewed interest in Africa must be ascribed to the fact that despite a series of economic challenges, the continent is on the threshold of significant economic transformation and development in the shorter, medium, and longer term. Africa is about to embark on an exciting process of industrialization, closing its infrastructure gap and unleashing its massive cultural and resource wealth, as well as digital industry. It is no wonder that an increasing number of countries are recognizing the continent's growing economic and demographic weight. It is forecast that the continent's population will increase to approximately 2.4 billion people by 2050, and that consumer and business spending will rise to roughly $16 trillion in the same year. So there's certainly huge potential on the continent. Let me get to Africa and China cooperation, the next phase. It is most encouraging to note, as I said right at the outset, that over the last few decades, Africa and China's long-standing friendship and cooperation have really grown exponentially. And a lot of these things happened while I was in China. A number of Africa and China, I would call them game-changing measures, events were introduced and took place, introduced by both sides in consultation with each other, which further significantly enhances cooperation and will enhance cooperation in future. The first one is the Chinese released its first ever comprehensive and constructive white paper on China and Africa cooperation, titled China and Africa in the New Era, a Partnership of Equals. This was released on 26 November 2021, the first Chinese white paper on cooperation with Africa. And this document very adequately reflected the successes of China-Africa cooperation in the last few decades, but more importantly, maps out the way forward regarding collaboration. And I think this is very important and relevant to our discussion today. Secondly, this was followed by the productive 8th Ministerial Conference of FOCAC, which was held in Dhaka in November 2021, which also assessed the progress of the implementation of the decisions by FOCAC at the 2018 Beijing Summit, and also charted the way forward for Africa-China relations over the next couple of years. The third game-changing event was the signing of the cooperation plan between the government of the government of China and the African Union, on jointly promoting the construction of the Belt and Road between the two sides in December 2021. This indeed augurs well for future expanded BRI cooperation. The fourth event was, in its of political and diplomatic significance, is that the African heads of state and government approved the opening up of an AU permanent mission to China at the summit in February 2022. In taking this step, which was welcomed by Beijing, the AU has signaled its strong desire to elevate Africa-China cooperation to a higher strategic and comprehensive level. Equally, Beijing's decision to open its own permanent mission to the AU in Addis Ababa also demonstrated that Beijing wishes to increasingly work with China in a coordinated and a more focused manner. And of course, the fifth one we will come to, and there are a lot of other examples, but the important economic promotion events like the CAETE and the China International Import Expo. I actually attended both of these events. The one was in Shanghai and the other one in Changsha, and saw how, to the length to which the Chinese went, their commitment and the willingness to give concrete substance to their promises to work with Africa and to open up markets. And I'll come back to that. So these game-changing events have already undoubtedly injected a kind of a new impetus into China-Africa into the comprehensive strategic and cooperative partnership between the two. Let me move on quickly to FOCAC, which is really probably the main and key driver, a most potent force in China-Africa bilateral relations. Of major importance was President Xi's constructive proposals at the FOCAC ministerial meeting in November 2021. And what was of specific significance of this range of China and Africa Vision 2035 programs? This was based, and I was there at the time, on in-depth consultation, exchanges of views, joint preparation for this program, which President Xi announced. And of course, all these programs are to a large extent aligned with the key and major requirements of Africa's development plans, whether it's the AU Agenda 2063 or whatever. But the areas that he lifted out was, you all aware of that. You've all seen that it was medical and health, poverty reduction, trade promotion programs, investment promotion, digital innovation, green development, capacity building, cultural and people-to-people exchanges, and peace and security, silencing the guns, which is also another very important issue, which we won't have time to address today in detail. But these programs, all these 9 sectors that he identified, as I know, are currently receiving attention as we speak. It can thus be anticipated that FOCAC and the BRI will further grow as important platforms for Africa, China, to jointly implement all these things that they discussed at Dakar and much broader. I'm probably going to skip the next part linked to these 9 priorities, which I just listed. There was a long list of other key issues which are of vital importance to China, to Africa in their cooperation, which were discussed. It's the issue of, I'm just going to briefly touch on that, new industrialization, of course, very important diversification of their economies and trade and investment, increasing manufacturing capacity are critical. The second one was to invest more in basic infrastructure. The third is boosting the extractive and mining and beneficiation industry, which we've been talking about for a long time, but it needs attention. The further development of special economic zones linked to the AFCFTA on the continent with the continued support of China. Then there is the issue of climate change of vital importance, a massive threat for Africa, and that needs attention. There's the issue of urbanization. Urbanization historically has always gone hand in hand with growth, and the delay in planned, organized urbanization in Africa has affected its growth, and it needs attention. Then there is the issue of the oceans economy, which we've also been talking about a lot, or that also should be seen as a priority. There's the issue of debt. Both sides should increasingly strive towards a sound debt management framework, as well as transparent and sound fiscal policies for sustainable development. There's the question of harnessing the demographic dividend through cooperation and education, with a special focus on the fourth industrial revolution, which the application of the fourth industrial revolution is technology, which could rapidly improve productivity and job creation. Then there's the issue of good governance and institutional capacity support, corruption, tax evasion. Those are go without saying. And then joint cooperation. A thing that I think is very important for Africa is the issue of the prioritization of development projects, given the limited resources on the continent. And of course, again, I've just put in the issue of peace and security, silencing the guns. So as Africa is regarded as an investment destination, and this all comes out of Dakar, with significant untapped potential, and in order to continue expansion of two-way investment, China undertook in Dakar to invest a further $60 billion in Africa by 2035. Especially in support of African agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, environmental protection, digital economy, and the blue economy. So in terms of investment promotion, China also said in Dakar that they will encourage its businesses, Chinese companies, to invest no less than $10 billion in Africa over the next 3 years, and will establish a platform for China-Africa private investment promotion to facilitate this. So this is a mouthful. A lot of very constructive proposals that were put on the table, and which, as I said, are now receiving attention as we move to the next round of FOCAC. And there will be further meetings on FOCAC later this year. And I think the next ministerial meeting, I think if I remember correctly, is next year. let me just say something about a very key issue, and that is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which Elizabeth also alluded to. A key development and top priority on the continent as far as economic promotion and development is concerned is the implementation or the successful implementation of the AFCFTA. Despite many headwinds, trade between Africa and China jumped to a record level of $216 billion in 2022, which was 11% year-on-year growth, and it continues to grow. And this happened partly as a result of Beijing's increasing push to boost imports from Africa, and I'll come back to that. As we're all aware, the CFTA represents a comprehensive plan which seeks to create a single liberalized market for goods, services, capital in a 55 nation bloc of 1.3 billion with the US GDP of $3 trillion. So it has huge potential in supporting Africa to advance integrated cooperation. China has agreed, and this is very important, and I hope that all Africa's partners will do that, to actively participate in the development of the AFCFTA and provide continued support to the Secretariat of the AFCFTA towards the full and the rapid full implementation of this important initiative. With the establishment of this agreement and increasing involvement of Chinese firms, China and Africa are set to benefit by leveraging the AFCFTA to, in a way, boost back exports to China. And a lot of work needs to be done, and I know that China and our people are talking about this. There are issues which, as I said, a lot of work remains to be done. And China could assist in this regard. The first is to encourage progressive liberalization of cross-border trade and investment policies in line with the AFCFTA protocols to establish the groundwork for regional value chains in Africa. Secondly, to streamline customs and border procedures and upgrade infrastructure to reduce long delays at borders, etc. Then there's just the issue of to strengthen cross-border trade and investment in services by facilitating trade in digital services, removing FDI restrictions, and liberalizing the movement of workers. These are all things that increasingly will require attention. The Africa side, which continues to face major economic and development challenges, as I said, currently has high expectations for China and Africa cooperation to boost economic recovery, and Africa is therefore eager to actively expand cooperation regarding value-added exports to China. China has noted these African concerns and consequently announced a series of practical results-based measures which would further facilitate trade. In fact, China is taking active measures to encourage imports from Africa, especially non-resource products. And I've listed a few of them. A lot of these came out of Dakar and other discussions. The first one is establishing a pioneering zone for an in-depth China-Africa trade and economic cooperation, and a China-Africa Industrial Park for Belt and Road cooperation. The second is the launching of a trade promotion program by providing $10 billion of trade finance to support African exports. Third one is supporting Africa in increasing export capacity by inter alia strengthening cooperation with countries on the continent on the inspection and the quarantine of agricultural produce and food. accelerate quarantine processes and import more value-added African products. These things are happening at the moment. I was at the Chinese embassy the other day, and there was a very interesting discussion on this very issue. Working forth towards balanced growth of bilateral trade, China will aim to reach $300 billion in total imports from Africa over the next 3 years by opening green lanes for African agricultural exports to China. The last one is by increasing the amount of products that can be exported to China tariff-free, with the growing number of African countries already exporting more than 90% of their products to China tariff-free. And this process is continuing. There are increasingly new countries that's being added to this list. I'm coming towards the end. I want to say something about Hunan. As I said, I went there and I saw what was happening at the CAT a year or two ago. The third China-Africa Economic Trade Expo, which was held in Changsha, was indeed a commendable initiative and represented, again, concrete evidence of China's unwavering commitment to actively expand its economic relations with Africa and open markets. It ran like a thread through everything I saw in Changsha. This is the biggest platform for economic and trade cooperation under the framework of FOCAC. And then this year, the expo was bigger than ever before. The figures are there, and I'm sure that the people from Hunan will talk about that. And then a lot of a total of 120 projects were signed, amounting to about 10 billion US. So all these things happened. And I also can just say that I was always impressed with Hunan, because they've always taken new initiatives to explore new and innovative ways for economic and trade cooperation with Africa. Last week in Changsha, the China-Africa Trade Index was released, and it compared with a base reading of 100 recorded in 2000. It rose to 990.55 in 2022, showing that bilateral trade remains on a rapid upwards growth trajectory and is likely to continue to scale new heights. Let me just say in conclusion, what is important for Africa and China cooperation on the continent is that projects based on Chinese financing and support need to be increasingly linked to concrete benefits for Africans, such as concern for enhancement of local labor, local procurement, very importantly, the environment. In other words, the message must be very clear that there are concrete benefits for the people of Africa from this cooperation. In this process, it is critical for Africa to demonstrate to its people that it has the ability to pursue its own preferred homegrown development and hence cooperate with China and other international partners in a manner that increasingly enhances Africa's key priorities. What is also important for Africa and with Africa's interaction with China and Africa's interaction with all its international partners, whether it's the EU, US, and so on, is that it is in Africa's own interest to ensure and demonstrate that it is optimally positioned in order to maximize the benefits and gains from the opportunities offered by China and the other international partners. Over recent years, we have seen greater efforts by the AU and Africa to exercise agency and ownership in pursuing their development efforts. These efforts, which were captured in AU Agenda 2063 documents and other documents, and of course on documents on AU institutional and capacity building reform, remain highly relevant and of great importance to create strong institutions on the African side to deal with international partners. In other words, Africa will have to increasingly approach China and, in fact, all its international partners in a more empowered, coordinated, collective, and strategic manner than hitherto. Africa, vis-a-vis its people, needs to increasingly to be seen to be, quote unquote, in charge of its own destiny, and that Africa is treated as an equal and with respect. I can just say that I have read a lot of Saya's stuff on China over the last number of years, that I agree with the broad approach and the broad sense that the current Africa-China relations over the last few decades, that this relationship has been mutually beneficial and that it will continue to expand in scope and depth. And China and Africa are, in fact, in my view, standing at a new historical juncture against the background of what is happening in the increasingly complex world. But China and Africa are standing at a new historical juncture in further consolidating, promoting, and embracing broader and more strategic economic cooperation at an increasingly higher level. So there is indeed a bright future for Africa-China economic and trade cooperation to mutual benefit. I thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think that that forms a really good platform on which to build. I think maybe just to pick up on a couple of things that you spoke about. I think it's absolutely critical that the relation, if any relationship is to be beneficial, and if we are to really take advantage of the opportunities presented by our own agreements here, specifically the Continental Free Trade Area and the building of regional value chains, that we obviously also need to make sure that our systems, our policies, our regulatory frameworks are such that this can be taken advantage of. So there is a responsibility on our part, both at the sub-regional level as well as at the continental level, to really look at harmonization, at creating the incentives where the incentives have to be, and really to be able to encourage investment. I think the second point that I want to make there relates to the opportunities that this can present. We talk about industrialization, but in the 21st century, in the third decade of the 21st century, specifically industrialization with a green tinge. In other words, it's not the industrialization that happened in the UK in the 1800s, but it clearly has to be, and this is an opportunity because we can certainly leapfrog. And then in that regard, also when we talk about green, of course, the importance of critical minerals, many of which sit in China, but many of which also sit in Africa. And I think we, on the African continent, we also need to think about how we make sure that we benefit from the fact that we have these minerals, rather than sort of replicating patterns of the past. And then the last point, of course, and here I defer to my colleague on my left about demographics. And there's a paper we have just produced on China and the demographic trend there, and there's another one coming out on BRICS. But the African continent, of course, is the young continent. It is the continent of the future, and we shouldn't take it for granted that because we are a young continent, things will just fall into place. And that goes back to my first point. So let me leave it there. Thank you very much, Ambassador. A very sort of comprehensive setting out of where we are in the relationship. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Kobus van Staden, who many of you know, if not from SIRE, then most definitely from the China Africa Project and the China Global South podcast. I would suggest that you all listen to it in your cars when you're driving every week. He will moderate the conversation and then also the discussion, and then also, of course, to welcome my colleague, Dr. Lauren Johnston, and let me also do the same to Professor Jean-Claude Maswana, who is online, I think, from Ritsumeikan University. I don't think I got that right, in Japan. So over to you, Kobus.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you so much, Ambassador Grobler. It was a fascinating presentation. We'll move right ahead into our first session, which is we're focusing specifically on the role of Hunan. And so for the, as you'll hear more through this session, Hunan province in China is unique in setting up very comprehensive trade architectures to encourage trade with Africa specifically, and integrating that trade into other forms of regional trade. So it's a very interesting development, I think, for Africa. So without further ado, I can, as you'll see in front of you, there's a small abstract of an upcoming paper by Lauren that SIRE is bringing out soon. SIRE brings out so many papers that it has a very, very kind of like dense kind of publications pipeline, which is, a fantastic thing. So that paper will be with us soon, and it focuses in a lot of detail on this Hunan, on the developments in Hunan, and on trying to identify what one could call a Hunan model of China-Africa trade. So Lauren is a consultant senior researcher in the foreign policy program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And she holds a PhD in economics from Peking University. And she's also at the same time an associate professor in China at the China Studies Center at the University of Sydney. So she focuses a lot on economics and the political economy of Africa-China relations, on Belt and Road Initiative, and on demographics. She's worked before at the University of Melbourne, at Beijing Foreign Studies University, at the World Bank, and as an ODI fellow in the Ministry of Development and Economic Planning in Sierra Leone. So I'm handing over to Lauren. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kobus. And thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. I only have 20 minutes. So my one caveat is that indeed I am Australian, not African. So I can't go to FOCAC. I can't go to lots of these events. I try to follow this from an economic scholar perspective, but perhaps being Australian almost helps because I'm unfortunately now old enough to see how positive seeds can sometimes develop in ways that people don't foresee, and in adverse ways to some extent. And I think one of the reasons these ties in Australia and China have got so complex is because people didn't necessarily see the future and plan for that ideally, because they didn't really understand where things were going. So part of what I will focus on in this Hunan story and why I decided to look at it is because I think it helps to shed light on where the future is going, and maybe that can help the mapping out, and it can help everyone working in this area to kind of navigate that in the best win-win way from ahead of time rather than later on in this quagmire almost. So Hunan, as Ambassador Grobler said, this has become a kind of a test site. So my structure is like Africa, China, 21st century economic ties, very quick. Then why Hunan? What is this Hunan model, as I'm calling it here? And then opportunities and challenges. So quickly, so basically the 2000s, 1990s China-Africa economic ties took off, partly thanks to China becoming net externally energy dependent. So they needed new sources of resources and so on. And that led to these amazing growth rates and this whole Angola model of, well, how can we actually get these resources from Angola or Sudan or wherever, and this new lending model. And then in the 2010s, this model became, or these ties became a little more complex, partly thanks to just the fact that the trade was so biased towards a few resource-rich countries, the trade structure. This wasn't the optimal development model for the African end. It was really about China's enormous resource needs. And then you had the global financial crisis, which changed the interest rate globally, changed the kind of incentives and trade patterns and growth patterns. And then demographic change. China's by around 2010, its working age population peaked. And so its own structure at home and its pressures at home start to change. All of this. And then, of course, you've got in that decade, you've got these geoeconomic tensions emerging, especially between China, Australia, China, US, China, West. But the China, US, Australia ones are particularly important in the area of agriculture. And the one thing you have to remember is that the greatest red line, obviously it's political red lines, but really the greatest red line in China is food security. This is like people need to be able to eat. And that is the ultimate red line. And that's a bit of a red line for, in some countries in Africa, there still is, there's just so much potential for elevated food productivity, and there's growing population. So there's a need to increase food security. So this is that's a bit of the story. And so basically within a few months of Trump imposing, or this whole trade war beginning, this was July 2018. September 2018 was FOCAC in Beijing. And that was when this China-Africa Economic and Trade exhibition in Changsha was first announced. It was announced in Xi's speech at FOCAC in 2018, like within 2 months of these trade tensions. So not that there wasn't all those other pressures, but there may be a link in this okay, we also need to diversify our kind of economic relationships and our sources of security. So next slide. So then just jumping ahead slightly. So when I was looking, I kept seeing these kind of Hunan seeds in following China, Africa. And then I was like, why would they base it in Changsha? Like if you've traveled all around China and you've been to lots of places, Changsha is a little random. I'm not saying it's not great, but to the outside eye, it would seem a bit random. And so then you look at like Kunming in southern China, the capital of Yunnan, for a long time has been this kind of concentrated hub for China-ASEAN ties. They hold lots of ASEAN events in Kunming. And that's partly geographic. It's close to Laos, it's close to Myanmar and so on. Then Ningxia, and the capital is Yinchuan, is the home of China, Middle East, North Africa ties. And part of that is because that's the kind of home within China of the Hui Muslim minority. So you have this kind of, halal food culture and so on. It fits for this kind of MENA, and Ningxia is the home of Islamic banking in China also. So then I'm like, and then Macau for the Lusophone angle, the Portuguese connection. So I'm like, okay, so why Hunan in Africa? Like just from an outside perspective, I just wanted to kind of see like, why have they chosen Hunan? And so really this is just to give you a kind of a little bit, obviously China and Africa are not now restricted to Hunan. This is just the Hunan angle to the story. And so this is for those who don't know China well, this is a bit of a kind of an interesting angle. So Hunan is the province in red, and Hunan itself means south of the river. Oh, sorry, south of the lake. Hu means lake and Nan means south. And so it means south of the lake. And just to give you that kind of perspective in China, Beijing means northern capital. Just south of Beijing is Hebei, which means north of the river. South of Hebei is Hunan, which means south of the river. And then Hubei means north of the lake, and Hunan is south of the lake. So if you're ever unsure of Chinese geography, just go south of Beijing, and it's first is north of the river, south of the river, north of the lake, south of the lake. And that tells you those 4 inland provinces. And the reason that's relevant here is because it explains the kind of geographic background to the agricultural depth of Hunan. It's this ancient, it's a bit like the kind of Nile Valley. You can almost, in a very generic sense, you can think of it that way. It's got all these waterways, it's got these ancient settlements, and it's this kind of famous agricultural heartland. So just again, very quickly, you just see this is just to show you that kind of water concentration. There's some very dry provinces in China. It happens Hunan's not one of them. And so you have all these waterways which then form, and the size is around the size of Senegal or Uganda, population 80 million. So almost no one's heard of Hunan outside of China. But there's only maybe Ethiopia, DRC, Nigeria, maybe Tanzania that have a population larger than Hunan alone, let alone all of China. And then, so just to give you a kind of a sense, this is the kind of evocative picture of rural Hunan, and these rice paddies go back 11,000 years. So it's like really like a deep agricultural history. And that explains why today it's at the frontier of China's rice industries, of some of China's agri-tech industries, some of China's kind of food industries, and partly why it's being used as the place for all this new push for, green lanes for African agricultural products. They land in Changsha if they come by air freight, and they have all these sophisticated agricultural processing and safety standards and tech. It's really like a frontier for that. So why is it this random Hunan province? That's why. And then, you have this kind of revolutionary background. Mao Zedong is from Hunan. This is the famous statue of Mao in Hunan in Changsha. And then in agriculture, it has this amazing background. So if you're trying to foster agricultural productivity in Africa and in China now, because it's got this added pressure from America and it's got growing food requirements of its own, climate change, so on. So the most famous kind of agriculturist is Yuan Longping, who's the agricultural guy credited with the hybrid rice innovations that basically enabled all Chinese to have rice. So he's the kind of, and he's from Hunan. And then even today, kind of leaping forward, Xu Dongyu is the head of the FAO, and he's the son of Hunanese rice farmers too. So, you have this like deep agricultural roots. And then building on all that history and those waterways and that place of agricultural productivity, you have the Zoomline is one of these agricultural tech firms, does like, technology for monitoring crops and data and so on. And then also in Hunan happens to be sunny, which most of you who follow China, Africa, or China, or any sort of construction wouldn't have heard of sunny. So it's an enormous global kind of heavy industry manufacturing company. And it has a presence in South Africa and other parts of Africa already. But it also has its home, the Kili Mall, which is less well known, which is a Kenyan-based digital commerce kind of frontier that is expanding into Nigeria, Uganda, and elsewhere, has its roots in Hunan also. And then railways. Hunan, I didn't list off the companies, but China's electronic, like fast train kind of empire began in Hunan. So all these train networks that are being fostered between China and Africa, some of the technology and the kind of origins of that also come from Hunan. So you just see all these, like it's such a random province, but you can see perhaps this economic complementarity logic. So what is it? Hunan, so then like very recently, so I started working on this paper last year, and then just around the recent China-Africa trade exhibition, these news stories were coming out. And then, so from what I found looking, it's basically two major platforms, which the ambassador mentioned. The first is the exhibition, which the ambassador has been to himself and was telling us about. And the second one is the deep cooperation zone. So I'm going to focus, this is just a slight introduction. So you see, I think of this Keynote, which I haven't been to, but a little bit like a mini Davos, but more with a trade focus, but to have events and matchmaking, and they match entrepreneurs and traders, they showcase products. What I thought was interesting this year was that the event was timed like maybe 2 days after the summer Davos in Tianjin. So a little bit of crossover. So for example, Standard Bank, which has very close ties to China, some of its staff went straight from Tianjin to Changsha for these two events. So I don't know if that was accident or deliberate, but if they plan those two to be aligned going forward, it might help to build the Keynote in ways that people don't expect. And I might jump over, this is some of the background to those events, but I might go into the deep cooperation zone. So from what I found just looking is that the deep cooperation zone has a planned institutional structure of 1 core, 3 areas, and 5 functional clusters. And these should be particularly interesting to South Africans because there's lots of crossover in terms of the industries in focus. So the 1 core is the Gaoqiao Grand Market, which is just the classic, a bit like the one in Yiwu. I think there are 3 enormous kind of wholesale markets in China. and this is like buying and selling kind of, you know, frenzy. And that is the actual place where Kaita takes place, you know, biennially. But normally it's like a permanent kind of big market, a wholesale market. And it's located inside a much bigger kind of Hunan free trade pilot for Changsha. That I shouldn't be there. I think so far more than 100 small, typically small scaled. I heard when I was doing this research, some people said, you know, the scale issue, you've got these tiny African SMEs and they're dealing with these enormous Hunanese state-owned enterprise or private Sunny and so on. That is a bit of a scale issue. But nonetheless, these you know, typical small coffee brands and so on are inside this grand market, you know, selling their products, chili from Rwanda and so on. And then the three, so that's the one core, the three areas, Changsha Free Trade Airport Zone, the Yueyang Chengli, so is the Chenglingji Comprehensive Bonded Zone, and the Changsha Jinsha Economic Development Zone. So these have a kind of, these are three areas inside the bigger project. And the first one, the Changsha Free Trade Zone, is really about kind of air freight. So you see, this is one aspect of it. This is trade via air. The second one is about kind of connecting Changsha to the water ports in Guangzhou and Shanghai and so on. So it's a kind of a waterways based trade, and both in and out. And they've managed already through like this Hunan Guangdong Africa to reduce the trade between Hunan and Africa by a day or something like that so far. And then the third one, the Changsha Jinsha Economic Development Zone, is about bulk commodities. So they've kind of got these three areas covered, and they're focusing on these three different types of trade in terms of logistics. How do you get the trade happening? And then these are the 5 national clusters. And these, if I was a South African, you know, I'd really be watching these. And how on earth is South Africa going to cooperate with these agendas in a way that doesn't get them into a quagmire in 10 years, let alone in 30 or 40 years' time? So the first is the Changsha China Africa Construction Machinery Industry Cluster. That's probably brackets Sunny. We say there must be other companies also, but Sunny is that in a global sense already. Then the Shangtan China Africa Mining Machinery Industry Cluster, same again, but with a focus on mining. So you just see these, you see how this is really targeted to some of the potential to develop African mineral resources. So again, just working out what's going on in there and working out how to make that optimally win-win. Shaoyang China Africa Economic and Trade, and then the Liaoyang. So these are just 2 kind of standard economic trade. Then the final one, Hunan Precious Metals Deep Processing Cluster. So again, that's like more about the mining value added and how do you develop these minerals. So, you know, if from any resource-rich Africa country, there's just must be so much to look more deeply into what's going on and how to optimize that. And then overall, the zone has 3 major goalposts for 2025. There's this renminbi trade of 14 billion with Africa, which implies this growth rate of over 30%. And then serving the national BRI strategy. So Belt and Road is obviously about building bridges and unlocking landlocked economies and so on. Hunan itself is a landlocked economy within China. So you can almost think of Hunan as the equivalent of like a Uganda, and it's trying to, you know, build its links. The third is to build a demonstration frontier. And so in general, the whole thing is about resolving bottlenecks. So focus on deepening production-oriented trade, fostering cross-border, all these things that the ambassador just said, encourage the continent led by African countries to support deep cooperation. And in turn, this will drive Hunan. So you see all these logistics, all these, you know, from finance to building the construction industries and the supply chains to foster all this trade. And then that in turn will drive Hunan's economy. So Hunan is like a second-tier China development frontier, and then that can help Africa to grow too. So I've got to talk a bit quickly to finish this in 2 minutes. Maybe Cobus will give me 1 more minute. China, Africa, cross-border. This is just so within that broader structure, there's an unbelievable array. You can't, like, you could spend out like days and weeks going down every hole and finding this new initiative, this policy thing, One is the China-Africa Cross-Border Renminbi Center, which has this fascinating barter trade initiative on the one hand, and then pushing the use of the renminbi on the other. And so the barter trade initiative is interesting. And I'll just kind of jump to it. What's interesting is that it uses just local currencies. There's no dollars, there's no euros, there's no whatever. And so China, but it even just uses local African currencies, but only up to basically the level that those African countries export to China. So in African countries, Hunan's agricultural machinery is exported to a certain country, and they get payment in the local currency of that country. And then they use that to buy other products back. So obviously this restricts the trade to like a relatively low, however much. It almost incentivizes those countries. It's like, we've got your local currency from selling this. We've let you pay us in your currency, but we want to give you back your currency. But like we can only, so you see, but so it's a very nascent. It's not going to change how currency markets work, but it's still this very small frontier of buying and selling using African currencies, kind of up to a certain level. And then the second one is the internationalization of the renminbi, which I won't go into. I hope there's a few people from Standard Bank listening, just because they are really on the frontier of this in Africa and bilaterally. So if you really want to know what's going on there, become a client of Standard Bank, maybe. So China. So China has, traditionally made this very hard, but it's basically loosening some of this. And Mauritius, South Africa, Tanzania are part of the focus of this, of just allowing much more renminbi to flow in and out of China and across borders. And to, this renminbi center is to serve as a frontier for accelerating state-owned supply chain financial platforms supported by ICBC. ICBC owns 25% of Standard Bank. So that's why Standard Bank is really tied into this. It's enormous. I mean, there's all sorts. You could be a full-time researcher just on the renminbi and ties between banks in Africa and emerging, and you still wouldn't be able to probably know what's going on. So, this is media reports of these new banking agreements, and then that will ultimately feed in. And a lot of it is happening through this little renminbi hub in Changsha that no one's ever heard of. And then just quickly, so you have a China-Africa Economic and Trade Innovation Demonstration Park. This is how you do it. These are successful brands. And marketing that, putting that live on social media and so on. China-Africa Digital Services Hub. This is fascinating. There's lots of data. China, like, helping its companies to have access to internet platforms. This is how you get your communications working in Africa. This is how you get lots of I'm finishing. China, and then digital service, and then China-Africa economic. There's like a research partnership going on. There's a university in Hunan assigned to really deeply study China-Africa and to deeply do lots and lots of China-Africa economic trade studies. Digital service. I don't think anyone in Africa has these equivalent services support. This is how you do your e-commerce logistics, like building websites in Swahili. Who at the Africa End has the same amount of service to access the Chinese market and be supported? Like, it's very different. It's a very kind of almost, it's wonderful, but how do you make that a bilateral kind of across all these countries and languages and so on? And then China, Africa, there's the think tanks. And then this last one, technology, trade measures, research and evaluation base. It literally is fostering standards and export of standards, and from agriculture to technology and studying all that. There's so much going on, like a very kind of small local level, but this gives you a kind of a window to where it all might go in future and what the priorities are. So this, I don't have time. So that was just a reminder of the Belt and Road, that it's all very, very consistent with the Belt and Road. So don't get, the Belt and Road promises currency to foster currency circulation, policy dialogue, people to people ties. don't get distracted by Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, all these other things, like the 10 initial points of the Belt and Road launch. Really always go back to them. If you're confused, just go back to the 10 principles of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road launch, and you can re-anchor yourself in the policies. And so the paper has the kind of list of like recommendations and so on. I haven't been to Keynote. If I was a business person, they might be different. This is from a, very from a scholarly perspective, but really like that was a tiny bit of an introduction. There's more in the paper of all these are made, from standards to data sharing to like all sorts of research. And then the mining and the metallurgy, so much going on. And China has quite a centralized agenda relatively. I'm sure Chinese people would say it's not centralized because they're in the fragmentation. But from your lens, it would seem they have more centralization. Different impact on different African countries, of course, have different comparative advantages. South Africa will be much more affected by those metallurgy and so on than other countries for whom it might be wonderful to start getting access to them. China itself has institutions. Just wanted to add this in. When China was fostering this equivalent relationship with mostly the West, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, so on, they mostly used joint ventures, a lot of joint venture partnerships, even if it seemed improbable at the time. I always say, go back and talk to the Hong Kong businessmen in 1980 and tell them and ask them how frustrated they were. Like they were probably frustrated until the late 90s. So just remember that it's almost like you maybe owed 20 years of frustration in a joint venture just because China probably frustrated its joint venture partners for 20 years. So don't forget that in setting up these partnerships and the scale imbalance and so on. I think I've already gone over time. Thank you.
So much. Thanks so much, Lauren. So what I would suggest, because we're running a little bit over time, what I would suggest is for everyone, I think we're going to be using our allocated time for our Q&A session for Jean-Claude's paper. So what I would suggest is for you to please write down your questions, please keep hold of them, and then include them in the policy roundtable that follows in the second session. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor Jean-Claude Maswana, who's joining us remotely from Japan. He is an esteemed economics professor at Ritsumeikan University's Graduate School for Economics, and he holds a PhD from Nagoya University, which is also my alma mater. The Go Meidai. His research focuses on economic growth and international trade, particularly focusing on China-Africa economic relations. He's the president of the African Finance and Economic Association, a board member of the Japan Association for African Studies, and a chair of the Congo Economic Circle. And he's also lectured at throughout the Japanese Ivy League, including at the University of Tokyo, at Kyoto University, and Tsukuba University. Jean-Claude, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much. I will be taking 15 minutes so that at least we will be able to have enough time to address some of the questions that can emerge from the audience. I'm not going to repeat what has been happening in a matter of trade between China and Africa, because this has been already addressed by the ambassador, and some of these aspects have been just addressed by Lauren. So I will be moving to the sort of problems that this bilateral trade is creating. And then I will be discussing this with in mind three issues emerging from trade. One is the trade imbalance. The second is the debt sustainability, which, based on the research I've done, is deeply rooted to the trade imbalance. And then the lack of local capacity building, which is at the bottom of the African problems in general, and the African weakness when it comes to benefiting from the potential generated from its bilateral interaction with China. I have carefully listened to the ambassador's opening remarks, and I was glad to learn about his experience and his view. on the opportunity China is creating for African development and the main initiative that China is putting in place to try to trigger sustained economic development in African countries. And based on the research I've done as a macroeconomist, I have no doubts that the relationship between China and Africa has benefit both sides. So the mutual benefit is obvious. The key question that I'm going to indirectly address will not be questioning whether the mutual benefit has been realized or not. The question is, what kind of mutual benefit and what does it mean for Africa? In terms of international trade, international economics, to put it just in very simple, we do have some theories predicting the impact of trade on countries to be of three natures, three types of outcome. One is the win-win, the mutual benefit type. The second is the sort of relative gain, which means one country will be benefiting more, depends on their technological know-how or the contribution that they're bringing in terms of technology, in terms of know-how to the achievement of target trade. And then the last is, of course, the win-lose, in which one side is winning and the other is losing. In the case of African countries and China, it could be of the second nature, meaning that the mutual gain is relative, meaning that China might be winning big, Africa's winning little, but both are indeed winning. Nobody or no side is losing. So as researchers, as policymakers like ambassadors or researchers or analysts like myself or Lauren, we need really to be a little bit careful in the way that we discuss this Africa and China relationship when it comes to its impact on African development. So I'm going to be looking into these three crucial issues within the framework of the nature of the benefit from trade, by first starting from the agreement that both sides have been benefiting from the trade interaction that was put in place more rapidly from the 2000 and onward. And then I'm going to use a framework of trade. And as I said before, I'm a macroeconomist. I speak by looking at data, and I will be really consistent by just talking about what I'm able to see from the data I have in front of me. So I'm going to use bilateral trade concentration and trade structure analysis. This is a well-known types of analytical framework used in macroeconomics. So the trade concentration consists of looking into what is the main types of products commonly traded by one of the partners in engaging in international trade, and then try to predict the sort of economic trends related to the specialization on that kind of product. So I will explain that much more clearly in the next table. And the trade structure analysis, this is in terms of the dynamic, in terms of how in certain period of time, the trade composition is changing, because the change in the trade composition reflect what we call the structural transformation, or in very simple words, this reflects the kind of skills a country or a region is exchanging with another country. When we talk about international trade, we record, we exchange products But when you analyze why countries are trading in certain products, behind that you have skills. A country will be exporting or importing certain kind of products because of two reasons: because they have that product from nature, or because they have the skills to trade that product at more competitive price compared to some other competitors. And then so basically, this is the framework that I'm going to use. And as much as possible, I've tried to make this very simple story non-technical. And then the table that you have here in front of you is using millions of trade data between African countries, so aggregated data from different African countries, but in terms of product categories, as well as bilateral trade from China to two categories of Asian countries. The first categories are called China East Asia 3. These countries include Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And then on the next table, I'm using China East Asia 5, which is another categories that we added two other countries, Cambodia and Indonesia, to make 5. And then I will explain in few minutes why this benchmark of developing Asian countries have been added to illustrate a little bit more where Africa is going in this partnership with China. Now, we have the two periods, 2000, so the trade structure in 2000, and the trade structure in 2015. So we have 15 years gap. And for those who might be interested in using this sort of data, especially those who might be students in the audience, just for your information, this way of classifying data that I use is the SITC, commonly known, is the most common, the most famous, widely used trade classification. So this word stands for Standard International Trade Classification. United Nations use it, and UNCTAD also use the same classification. We do have a different, right now we have a revision 4, but these data are based on the revision 2. And for reason we can discuss later on, if we have time to do so. And then, so basically, I categorize the products in 4 groups. The first is the resource intensive, which also include the primary products. So these are basic products, minerals, foods, oil, and so on. And then second category is unskilled labor intensive product. Some examples include textile, clothing, ships, and footwear. And then the third category is a human capital intensive product. Cosmetics, cars, watches, most of the manufactured products, they are usually included in the third category. And then the technology intensive products, so the chemical, electric items, and so on, much of the latest technology, they are in the 4 categories. Of course, in the CTEC system, we can create as many categories as we want. But for the sake of this analysis, I use these 4 categories because they were good enough to tell the story that I'm going to share with you quickly. And then on the first, the left-hand side of the table, you have trade in 2000. So you have, this is African total export and imports by these 4 categories. So the first category, I also disaggregated this a little bit in terms of oil, because oil, if you include Angola and in Nigeria, that represent a huge part of African export in terms of value and import. So I was disaggregating this, but this is part of, this is included in the primary product category. And then, so this is the share of the primary export of Africa and share of the primary import of Africa for primary as a share of the total export and import. And then this is the bilateral, what really we are interested in. Africa and China in these 4 categories, okay? And then this is others. These are categories not clearly specified in the Comtrade, the UN Comtrade database. And then this is the China and those 3 developing Asian countries are used as a benchmark. Why I use this as a benchmark? Because even though we can look at the trend on what is happening between Africa and China, but it's still very important to look at how other developing countries in Asia are performing when it's come to shifting trade composition of those countries. One of the key issues, one of the key criticisms, the key concerns, the ambassador, I was very happy that the ambassador mentioned this is issue of industrialization. Industrialization means bringing down the share of your production as well as your international trade in primary product, because most of the primary products, they came from nature, and then increasing more human capital intensive and technology intensive. So we will see how by the time, for example, from 2000 to 2005, how are the developing countries in Asia, some of which used to have a GDP per capita lower than some of the African countries that we have nowadays, and how those countries have been industrializing their economic structure. So we included that as a benchmark. And then, as I mentioned before, we downloaded million of data and classified them in terms of these 4 and 5 categories to try to see whether African is industrializing or not. In general, vis-a-vis China, and in comparison with other developing countries in Asia. So the first thing, now quickly, I have 7 minutes left. The first lesson to learn from this first table, I should mention that this first table for Africa includes all African countries, so including South Africa is included. In the next table, I will do the same exercise by excluding South Africa and then expanding the list of developing Asian countries to 5. Now, when South Africa is included, we can see the total. So what we are interested in is starting from unskilled labor intensive, human capital and technology. We can see the share of African export to China in terms of human capital intensive is around 10%. In 2000 is almost the same size, is around 10, is slightly lower. This in itself is not a good indication. So even though we can conclude that Africa is mutually benefiting with China, but there is an indication that something is not right. Now, the next one will be technology intensive. So this is, if you include South Africa and Mauritius, you get this size on this category, and it will remain also increased slightly in 15 years later. For not specified product is almost stable. When we look at the case of the export of this Asia 3, they started from much lower position, 31% of the total, and in 15 years, they're around 54. As you can see, this is in technology intensive exports. Okay? And what does it mean? It means actually China is offering different kind of trade opportunity. Some countries in Asia, they are able to take advantage of this for many reasons. One is the geographical proximity. But if you do, I perform the same exercise with Latin American countries, you will see in technology intensive, they are able to change a lot in 15 or 20 years, but African countries have not been able to do so. Now, The most interesting outcome is when you exclude South Africa. So by excluding South Africa, I should mention, I excluded South Africa and Mauritius. They are the largest contributors of non-primary commodity exports in African trade with China. By doing so, although the contribution of Mauritius is very small, but the contribution of South Africa is significant. If you exclude South Africa, then look at the contribution of technology intensive export is lower than even 1% of the total export. So it's almost non-existent, okay? And if you look at the same, for example, for human capital intensive, which used to show 20% something, when South Africa is included, it's now less than 2%, okay? And then if you look at the export of the rest of African countries, excluding South Africa and Mauritius in 2000, used to be 20% of primary product, of which almost 96% included oil export. And then if you look at in 2015, let's see, the export for the technology intensive is still less than 1%. But in the meantime, what is happening among developing Asian countries? As you can see, the exports of these 5 developing Asian countries have been expanding very fast. So they used to export 36% of technology intensive product to China in 2000, and 15 years later, at least that have moved to 45%. And you will see the human capital intensive is the same trend for Africa, is still very low. Okay, for human capital intensive is even falling by half. And then for these developing Asian countries, you can see that this part have been also falling for some reason we can discuss, but in exchange, they have gained more in terms of exporting technology intensive categories. So if we could have time, we will have been able to discuss in more details what does it mean in terms of skills content of the product, in terms of income generation, because technology intensive, when you check average price in international market, you will see the price of technology intensive and human capital intensive products have been multiplied by 3 in the last 15 years. So I mean, from 2000 to 2015. But when you look at the price of primary commodity or primary commodities such as oil or more unskilled labor intensive export, you will see the price fluctuation and the standard deviation is really huge. And the average of the price have remained virtually constant. And then this impacts on African development overall. And then in terms of trade, bilateral trade with China, the evidence is really very clear that Africa is still stuck within the colonial development pattern, which is not the result of China intention, but probably, I have discussed this before with some of the people in the audience. This is the result of policy making failure on the African side, the failure to aggressively involve in capacity building or skill development. So my time is out. I prefer being consistent. Thank you for your attention. And I'm more than happy to address any question or comments you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean-Claude. I think it would make sense for us to take a little break now. Why don't we reconvene in 10 minutes? So that's at 5 past. And then we can have an expansive session in which we can add questions from this session as well as from the upcoming two presentations. Thank you so much. See you in 10 minutes.
Kobus, before you start, maybe just some, not housekeeping, but just to say that I know a couple of people have asked for the presentations. What we usually do is we PST them, I think is the correct word, or PDF them, or whatever, in the equivalent of PowerPoint, and provided the presenters are happy for it, we will upload them. Of course, this is also being streamed on YouTube. So there we go, just in case you didn't know, it's been streamed, and so the event will also be available online, which means that you can listen and see the relevant PowerPoint presentations there as well, together with the explanations. I know that sometimes PowerPoints don't tell all the story. They're not supposed to tell the whole story, and certainly with the commentary on the side, that's very useful. The other thing to just highlight is then, and I think many of you have seen, but some of the publications that have come out from SIRE over the last year are available in hard copy. Should you prefer hard copy, they're outside on your left as you leave, as you go out of the room. And we also have QR codes if you just wish to download the relevant publication onto your phone. So please do make use of that opportunity. But just to say, we will obviously be uploading whatever we can. Great, thanks. Back to you, Kobus.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. So this session is focused on a conversation, on sparking a conversation between the people who have been focusing on these issues for a while, and everyone in the room and online, around how Africa should move forward in order to take advantage of all of this kind of trade architecture that's being set up in places like Hunan, and to position itself more broadly, to make itself more resilient in terms of coming challenges, but also to take advantage of some of the opportunities that Africa has. So we have a longish session around that, and to kick off the conversation, we're going to have short presentations, or short just kind of sharing of a few thoughts from two stakeholders who've been very kind of involved in the China-Africa space. First one is Ika Fu, who's I think joining us from China. I'm not sure. And she's a China-Africa policy analyst at the Beijing-based consultancy Development Reimagined, whose work has been really pivotal, I think, on these issues and on Africa's international positioning more broadly. Ika specializes in African development and China-Africa relations, and she has previous working experience at the African Union and at the International Finance Corporation. She has a master's in international affairs from George Washington University, and she's worked in key areas, including in debt analysis in Africa and beyond, and focusing on China-Africa trade and investment logistics and analysis. She's also the co-author of the book, The African Debt Guide, which takes a kind of a revisionist and I think very interesting kind of like perspective on the African debt issue at the moment, and kind of debunks some of the thinking around that. So we're going to hand over to Ika, and after that we'll hand over to Stephen Kuo, who I'll introduce then, and then we'll move into a broader discussion. So Ika, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kobus, and good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and depends on where you are. So thank you so much for the invitation, and it's also great pleasure to present during a SIRE event again. Also, I believe this webinar is really at the right timing, as we Development Reimagined, through our African Reimagined, our flagship projects, attend this year China-Africa Trade and Economic Expo just 2 weeks ago, and with the support from Africa Exim Bank, and to bring 20 Africa brands to China and to attend the expo. So without further ado, so let me first share some numbers to maybe set out the foundation for our discussion today. So as mostly you may know that China has remained Africa's largest trading partner for 14 consecutive years. And in 2022, the total trade between China and Africa hit an all-time high, so at 282 billion. So this reflecting a 10.9% increase compared to the previous year. So importantly, the imports from Africa account for 117.5 billion, 14.2% year-to-year rise. And China's import of agricultural products from China has increased remarkably, with an average annual growth rate of 11.4% in the recent years. But in other side, like Chinese export to Africa amount to 164.5 billion US dollar. So like after I set out this number, so maybe you can share more about like what we like beyond based on this number. So DR has participated the China-Africa Trade and Economic Expo since 2019 when it first began. So we kind of have witnessed how Expo has grown and gained more attention and also have more participation. So in 2019, so as a pilot, the Expo show of China-Africa economic diplomacy. So like the news, like CGTN news report that so at least 1,000 African guests and traders attend the first Expo. But this year, that number has been a significant increase. So like the official website from the Expo said that there are more than 12 international organizations with 1,700 enterprises, business association, and financial institutions from both China and Africa attend the conference, and more than 100K people, like 100 K people visit the Expo during these 4-day events. So while we have seen a big success this year with more Africa countries and brands participate into the Expo, and also we have noticed larger trade volumes between China and Africa happening this year. So there are still something we can do to reshape China-Africa trade relationship. So which will be that like more like the next step. So the first thing it's about like there are more balanced in favor of Africa countries that are needed. So in 2022, there was a trade deficit of $46.5 billion like existing. So this representing a significant expansion of 16.3 from the previous year, and meaning 33 African countries still have a trade deficit with China. So, and to address the trade deficit, we have observed that China has gradually extended zero tariffs policy in 2022. So according to Chinese official, there's a 98% of products from least developed countries would enter China duty-free. This is announced in September 2022. And the list included key export products from Africa, such as cashews, coffee, frozen fish, and other products. But it's still quite important, the next step that China can link to the AFCFTA, as maybe can provide a continent-wide preferential tracing, and also maybe to provide like the agricultural focused tracing. And I believe I had a paper with my colleague Ovi Gui and like from Forsaya to kind of analyze how BRI and AFCFTA can work together. So as AFCFTA already came into force in January 2021, and in October, AFCFTA Secretary China's Ministry of Commerce signed a MOU to establish an expert group on economic cooperation. So it's quite important in the next step, there's more concrete plan and discussion can happening between the two sides. So the second thing that we believe is kind of need to reshape between China-Africa relationship is about there's a need having more value-added product from China to Africa. So during the expo, so I kind of go around to see different country booths from Tanzania, South Africa, like Uganda, etc. So I have noticed like branded agricultural products like coffee, from Uganda or Ethiopia, and tea from Tanzania, etc., and wine from South Africa are quite dominant in any country booth. There's a lot of branded products, which is very good sign. But what we believe that diversification is also very important when related to imports goods from Africa. So because this will enable Africa country to access higher value market and tap into segment with greater purchasing power. So I think this is kind of one reason why like Development Reimagined and also Africa Reimagined, we brought fashion brands and skincare and jewelry, high-end jewelry brands, and also like fashion designer to Africa, to like from Africa to China this time to attend the expo, because we really want the Chinese consumer knows that in Africa, they still have a very good and high-end products. So lastly, something that we can reshape is quite necessary to linking the policy with the reality. So since the FOCAC 8, so we have seen that a lot of announcement or commitments, such as like establishing the green lands to support the Africa's agricultural products imported to China. And we have seen a kind of significant progress committed by China to help remove non-tariff barriers to trade. So right now, 11 new fresh agricultural products from 8 Africa countries have gained access to the Chinese market since FOCAC 8, including avocado from Kenya, and also maybe fresh fish, like etc. So, but I think in the reality in the market, so when I shopping in some big supermarket, there's still kind of a lack of the China like this kind of products in the market. So so what we believe that more can be done and should be done to unlock this kind of whole thing. So I think that is kind of some of the key takeaways from the expo, and I'm happy to share more when we enter into the discussion. Yeah, thank you for your attention, and thank you for the invitation again.
Cool. Thanks so much, Ika. That was very interesting. The we're moving on to quick comments from Stephen Kuo. Stephen divides his time between academia and the corporate world. So he's an adjunct senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business, and also a key account manager at Barlow World Equipment. And he's a frequent columnist on foreign affairs issues for Business Day, and also works closely with UCT's Graduate School of Business's business development unit on China and on broader Asian strategy. And he does a lot of consulting, or more specifically advising for Fortune 500 companies, particularly Chinese ones, focusing on construction, mining, telecommunication, on political and security and business issues in Africa. So Stephen, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from Hunan province. I'm actually on leave, and I'm at my wife, my in-laws' house at the moment. So I'm going to share with everyone. So all the speakers have been talking about, if you like, the macro policy. I'm gonna try to give everybody just the opposite side. As Kubus mentioned, for my day job, I run the China desk for Barlow World Equipment, Southern Africa. So my job is to look after Chinese customers who are, because we sell mining and construction equipment, right? So Southern Africa from Angola and Zambia southward. So I'm responsible for taking care of the Chinese customer base in these 11 Southern African countries. So I'm going to go right, if you like, case study style. So I was in Zimbabwe in April. No, so this is about March. I was in Zimbabwe in March. And I want to share with you two Chinese mining customers of ours. And then yeah, it's anecdotal, but I'm going to give everybody a bit of anecdotal on the ground experience. So for your information, if you want to make stainless steel, in addition to iron ore, you need chrome, right? And chrome, for all intent, it's found in South Africa and Zimbabwe. So if you want to make stainless steel, you need chrome. So when I was in Zimbabwe, firstly, I went to the smaller, privately owned Chinese chrome mining company. It's probably worth a few $1 million. They don't. So for chrome, you dig the ore out. It's normally surface mining, so it's not very complicated, and you can process it into ferrochrome, right? So you process it into maybe 20 or 30% concentration, and ferrochrome is about the size of your fist, and it's sort of basically processed, and then you can export that So we're speaking to those customers. They have some of our equipment. They have excavators, and so as you do, you see a mining customer. You have a chat. You see how things are, and he was complaining to us that first the electricity price is going up, so that's obviously a major cost, and he was also complaining that the Zimbabwean government, I don't know if they have done it yet, but they are going at the time they were going to ban the export of chrome, raw chrome ore. So you have to process it first, which puts a spanner in the works of people's financial modeling. Because if you invest in mining, you obviously do your maths. And so that was his problem. So he was struggling with that. That was his big problem. Here we have a Chinese investor. He's an investor. He has invested in a chrome mine. He's bought mining equipment, and he's digging up the chrome and he's supplying it to China. I think from Zimbabwe, I think it probably goes to Durban or Beira in Mozambique, and he ships to China. So he is probably a very typical Chinese privately owned mining company. There are hundreds of them across Africa, right? And normally the ore is shipped back to China because, as we know, China is the buyer, the driver of global commodity. So the problem for this particular Chinese small company was the shifting regulation. On the one hand, we know that Zimbabwe ought to, as Jean-Claude mentioned, I think most of us agree, African countries ought to allow more beneficiation, processing the ore a little bit more. However, this particular shift in policy is causing problems for a small Chinese investor. That's the first guy. Then we visited another site. So I was there in July last year. It's a Chinese private conglomerate based out of Wenzhou, that's in Zhejiang province, China. And they're probably one of the largest Chinese mining and processing companies. They're busy building a steel mill not far from Harare, right? They're investing $1 billion. They're building a steel mill. So I went on site, had a chat. The second time I was there, so invited me for lunch. So I was having lunch with them, and so at the steel mill, I think there, I don't remember exactly how many now. Around 3,000 people are employed to build this particular steel mill, so in order for you to have a steel mill, right, you need, in addition to the ore, which you have in Zimbabwe, there's iron ore, there's chrome, they need electricity. So they have now arranged for Chinese private investors to build a power plant, coal-fired power plant. They've arranged for Chinese investors to do the mining. So they're literally starting entire. It's not new, obviously, but they're starting it's going to be multi-billion US dollar investment. So if you just take a step back, Zimbabwe is under Western sanctions. So in a way, Chinese investment and other Asian investment has been coming through. And I was quite surprised. And when I spoke to the project manager, I said to him, look, so are you going to be, so what drove you, what's prompted you to come and spend $1 billion US and probably billions more? He said, I said, are you going, once the steel is made, are you going to ship it back to China? Are you going to sell it to Europe? He said, no, we want to sell it in Africa. Because iron ore is a very heavy thing. And if you ship it across to China and you ship it back, I mean, the transportation costs really eats up your profit. So I was completely astounded. This private Chinese company is going to mine and process the steel. And he was talking about finding other partners in Africa to process their raw steel into higher quality steel. So, I mean, in a way, I was very impressed, right? So as we chat about what is the next level, Laura, when you spoke about frustration by joint venture partners, it was the end of your presentation. So on the one hand, I teach at the business school, I do research, etc. On the other hand, I'm the coalface. I sell mining and construction equipment for Chinese construction and mining companies operating in Southern Africa. So I can see the problem these mining companies have. Right? It's regulation, it's shifting regulation, it's shifting prices, it's logistics, it's everything. It's environmental problems that it's really tricky. It's really very difficult for whether you are private or publicly owned, state-owned Chinese company to set up, whether it's Zimbabwe or South Africa, and to navigate all sorts of problems in order to I suppose, turn a profit. I think I'm going to sort of conclude my sort of initial remarks. I'm just throwing stuff out there to sort of encourage debate and see what everybody thinks. But I think I have been on this China-Africa research for more than 10 years, certainly. I wrote my doctorate on it. I'm South African Chinese, by the way, so I'm in China now, but I live in South Africa. So the field is shifting so quickly, right? I mean, it was the Angolan model where it's commodities for infrastructure. Now we got the Hunan model, and until 5-6 years ago, it was Belt and Road Initiative, where across South Africa, it was mostly Chinese BRI loans that paid for infrastructure. But now, as I go to these big Chinese state-owned companies who are building the infrastructure, most of them have no business because the BRI loans for infrastructure has been backed off quite a lot. And a lot of the Chinese state-owned companies don't have contracts at the moment. However, these Chinese state-owned companies who are building roads and bridges, paid for by the Chinese government, are now shifting to working for Chinese private companies doing mining projects, right? So it is quite a fast moving environment, this China and Africa game. So I don't really have a conclusion or easily give you a nice, so I'm just giving you, if you like, relatively anecdotal, but first person experience of two of my Chinese mining customers in Zimbabwe. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm also keen to bring out a perspective that's often not entertained in sort of policy circles. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, let's start up a broader discussion. So I think there's going to be a mic passing around. So anyone who has questions, go ahead. I think I'll kick it off maybe. Lauren, and maybe we'll start with you, and then other guests also please jump in. Just a very foundational, basic question. Like we see all of these kind of moves from China to increase imports from Africa, particularly agricultural imports. If you focus on agricultural imports for the moment, this commitment to to buying 300 million worth of African agricultural products. How does this trade with China and the potential for that trade with China compare to Africa's trade with the rest of the world? Like particularly from a future-looking perspective. So we see this kind of potential on the Chinese side. Is that potential being met anywhere else in the world, or is China kind of world unique in that respect?
I think Jean-Claude was the one who just presented that comparative paper. And in terms of how, from the macro end at least, how agricultural focus, if you even just look at the announcements since Keynote, which was only a month ago, even just looking at that, the few products that seem to now be flowing that weren't even flowing for Keynote, like new anchovies. I mean, these all seem small, but over time they add up. There's a Hunan, I didn't mention it, but when the paper comes out, you'll see it. There's just so many little project lines, one of which is a aquaculture fisheries development kind of model. And then there's a cluster in somewhere on the coast in Kenya. So these anchovies, and this is linked to Hunan even. And so that because there's Hunan, all those lakes and rivers, it has a lot of freshwater aquaculture. So maybe not ocean water aquaculture, but some very deep and well-developed kind of fisheries industries from the freshwater perspective. So there are ties. So at least on that, I mean, whether or not China's currently getting lots, maybe there's more competition for having already developed. And I guess on that, taking Jean-Claude's ASEAN comparison base, you have all sorts of challenges around, lots of competition for the fisheries, and then lots of boundary competition in Southeast Asia. So I would just say there's more greenfield aquaculture potential here. So on that is one kind of new area, much more greenfield kind of development potential and value added. How you reach that target is a different story, but that's definitely a growth area. And the barriers are probably most around the Chinese photosanitary, but requirements. But I think there's a big push at the Chinese end to challenge those, or at least to overcome them. So probably the trade war between the West and China has done a lot for China's willingness to work to improve the phytosanitary bottlenecks. There was probably a huge gift to that bottleneck between Africa and China. So maybe that's another thing African producers can do, is look at these areas where there's new challenges in terms of those frictions, and just maximize them, utilize them to speed up overcoming the bottlenecks between China and Africa, because there would be more willingness at the Chinese end now to push through whatever were the bottlenecks, if there's a third market issue with the US or someone else.
And Jean-Claude, just following up on that, if we staying with agricultural products for the moment, what are some, if you had to advise African policymakers about your top 3 suggestions for getting more African agricultural products on scale into the Chinese market, what kinds of recommendations would you give these policymakers? Like, what kinds of changes on the ground would have to happen for African producers to start really becoming bigger players in the Chinese market in the agricultural sector?
Thank you so much. I think I will just be coming back to the same story that I told before when it comes to the total trade. Adding value to African exports going to China. without adding value to an exported product, it doesn't matter how much you export. You can make more money, but if you keep exporting the same product over years, you will be moving, as I said in the beginning, you will be moving around a cycle. You can move faster, but you will be moving around the cycle. If you look at the GDP per capita of most African countries, in 1980, they were agriculture-based countries, as China used to be. But now you cannot compare the GDP per capita of China with African countries. The biggest difference, because started from 1980s, 1978, China started exporting different categories of product, and over time, reducing not really the quantity of export of agriculture, but the share of exports as a total of Chinese exports. And to do this, you need to upgrade the skills of people involved in agriculture, which is one of the essential ingredients you need to increase what we call the productivity of agriculture. So you shift the labor force out of agriculture by still producing enough to feed the local market, local population, and to keep your export market as before, but with fewer labor. And then that excess labor being transferred to manufacturing, to industrialization, you need really to give them more and more skills. Once again, exports boil down to skills that you are selling. Much of what we have in the nature, natural resources, everyone can have it. Many countries have them. In the past, China also used to have oil and some of this product. Okay? And most of African countries have the same kind of product from nature. What is needed is to add value. That process will lead to industrialization. Then China will need more African trade. At the pace that we are going to, I doubt that in 50 years, China will have any reason to import even food from Africa. I have a doubt. Because without productivity, without industrializing agriculture structure of Africa, in 50 years, some of the countries in Latin America and developing Asia will be able to sell at much cheaper price, or they are going to become more efficient than African countries in exporting some of the products that China need to get from Africa. Only for mineral resources, perhaps Africa will remain relevant. But for agriculture, the way that I'm seeing the trend that African countries are going is that some countries in Latin America are little by little going to secure Chinese market, even though the Chinese government, from a political point of view, for diplomatic point of view, might try to provide, to create what we call the virtual, the artificial competitive advantage to African countries by providing free tariff range of products entering China. But that can work in the short run. In much longer terms, that will be challenged by somebody, because we have to remember China is a member of the WTO. Any kind of temporary measure that China is providing to African countries in terms of free tariff on certain products based on the WTO own rules, this kind of discriminatory measure should be temporarily, so that you cannot keep them forever. At some point, some Latin American countries or the Asian countries are going to complain and bring the issue to the WTO and challenge China and African countries. So in the long run, African countries cannot expect protection from the Chinese government on their exported product into China. That is not feasible strategy, but right now, much of the effort have been on that front, and it's really, really not, it's worrying me. And I think to come back to your question, productivity through skill upgrade is essential. There is no other way, because China itself did that. And if there was some other alternative, a cheaper or easiest way, some shortcut, China will have picked up those alternatives itself.
Ika, Development Reimagined works closely with African officials and government stakeholders, and also you were obviously on the ground there, like kind of looking at some of these kind of developments up close. So it's a very similar question. If from your experience, if you had to recommend some kind of practical ways for like recommendations to African policymakers about kind of increasing their trade flows to China, what would some of the recommendations be?
Sorry, yeah, thank you, Cope, for the question. So I think first one, like the professor mentioned, so increasing productivity is quite important, and I think that can be done through some Africa officials. I think maybe I can give an example that like some of the brands we have reached out, like the coffee brands. So they actually is kind of small owned, medium-sized like farm, like coffee farm, and when they like reach out to us and want us to maybe help them to find the partners or distributors in China and to sell their coffee beans. But basically, like if I remember correctly, like Shanghai has most coffee shops in the world. And when we reaching out some big company like Luckin and other like coffee brands, so basically they need a huge amount of coffee beans. Like if that's kind of the smaller size, maybe that will be not kind of enough for them to kind of make a deal or have a successfully make a deal. So in such case, like means like maybe increasing the productivities in the maybe just using coffee as an example, like this also apply to the other areas that maybe increasing productivity is also quite important. And I think the second thing is quite a need from Africa policymaker to support the smaller size and medium-sized enterprises, and also help them to link Chinese market or maybe Chinese buyer or any Chinese investors if they are have such interest. Another example just from the ground is just what I heard during this time's expo. It's like some of the brands, I believe it's from South Africa brand. They are more like smaller size wine manufacturer company. They want to attend expo, but when they reach out to the trade department, but like alternative that there's no kind of a like subsidy to provide to this kind of SMEs to attend the expo, so which is a kind of a loss for them. So they reach out to our company, and then we help them arrange the visit. So they basically show their products and also already establish some partnership during the expo. So I think this kind of also means that a lot of smaller size, medium-sized enterprises in Africa, not only in South Africa, but in any other ways in Africa, still maybe face this kind of limitation. So they want to expand their market. They want to sell the products to China, but how they're going to approach to the Chinese market is quite there's a gap between these two things. So I think in such case, like Africa government and also policymaker can create such platform or maybe communication platform or channels, their trade department or embassies in China and also African ambassador to China. So maybe kind of create a link between the Africa smaller size SMEs with the Chinese market and Chinese investor. That would be also very important. So that I can share. Yeah, maybe as someone else from the presenter have more thoughts, but that's what I can share. Thanks.
Go ahead.
just to build on Ike's comment and also Jean-Claude's, since Kaita, so very recently, one of those extra things other than the Kenyan anchovies was an agreement between Zoomlion, this Hunan company that specializes in, I know it's an unusual name, but it specializes in agricultural technologies. So it basically works with improving crop yields and so on within Hunan. And now it's going global. So it offers all sorts of kind of agricultural productivity and cropping, monitoring, data analysis, yield, fertilizer yield, whatever, all sorts of agricultural data and monitoring. And they've just signed an agreement to work with coffee producers somehow. I don't know the details, but in Ethiopia, and that's following Kaita. So exactly that, to kind of elevate the yields, elevate the quality, and then theoretically that then may not skewer, I'm sure China can't grow enough coffee for itself over the next 30 years, whether or not Ethiopia can sustain a foothold in that market over other areas may depend on, for example, that partnership and how that can elevate productivity and deepen the ties. And then I'm not suggesting all the dots come together perfectly, but something I didn't go into in my presentation because I didn't have time was that China has it's really taking a lead in developing technical and vocational education and training in the global south. So, whereas for decades you've had this push by the traditional donors to foster primary education, a little bit of university education, TVET was really the kind of forgotten friend to some extent. And so about 2 years ago, China launched a World TVET Alliance or something. It was the first big kind of TVET global platform. And there's a small aspect of TVET training going on from the Hunan model. And that really does focus on building very technically enabled. So it's TVET training as it would be anywhere, but for agricultural technicians, for people to work in these kind of on whatever machines and so on are required. So whether the dots come together in any given country at any given time is a story of each of those two countries. But those are the kind of threads of this push to try to elevate that labor productivity. And does that prevent the fear that Africa's productivity doesn't reach the one Jean-Claude was just talking about? I don't know, maybe some countries, maybe not in others, maybe for some crops, not for others, whatever. But there is definitely a big TVET push. And then even already this Zoomlion Ethiopia coffee agreement, that's just in the last week or two to try and elevate coffee yields in Ethiopia and collect all the data and fertilizer and technology and so
on. Stephen, go ahead.
Just to build on what all the speakers have said, the one thing that is the scale. I've also sort of been involved in some of the agriculture export things. The scale that the Chinese buyer require and African producers are able to supply. Sometimes there's quite a big gap. I think we often hear about how supermarkets want these bananas of the same shape. You need that commercialization in order to supply at scale. So for things, the things that I've touched, things like beef, which is quite big in Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. Things like soybean, which is massively required in China. And apparently soybean growing conditions are the same as corn. So potentially South Africa could supply a lot of soybeans. However, in order for commercialization of agriculture, so big volumes, you need investment into silos, you need investment into the various logistic bottlenecks, right? You need $1 million cold storage. You need, all these things require financiers, require bankers to put the money down and to invest. And with agriculture, I think when it comes to grape and fruit trees, you need about 4 or 5 years from planting to harvesting, right? So there's an interim period where, so financing is quite important. So in order for your agriculture to go from artisanal to commercial, right? So the one thing that I like to contribute is that financing gap. And for my day job, that's also the problem. If you want financing for mining machinery in a country like Zimbabwe or Mozambique, interest rates are really, really high. So I think this is one of the problems faced by a lot of African countries, the cost of money and the cost of financing to get this kind of machinery and capital equipment. It's prohibitively high. And so that's where I would suggest where the bottlenecks are. Thanks.
Ambassador Grobler, yeah, please go ahead.
Just a very brief comment on agriculture. Africa has got enormous potential in agriculture. In fact, if you look at the arable land throughout Africa, Africa should not be in a situation where we still import a lot of food. We're increasingly exporting, but we are still importing too much food. So what Africa basically requires or needs is an African agricultural revolution. Agriculture throughout the continent needs to be modernized, mechanized. I mean, there's huge subsistence farming, but Africa, if we want to become a major player in terms of exporting to China, to the US, to Europe, wherever, we will have to modernize and add value to what we are producing. Food processing. I mean, what we need to do as Africa, when we talk, and I talked about that earlier, when we talk to our international partners, whether it's the Japanese or TICAD, or whether the Indians, these are the things that Africa needs to put on the table. Stephen just talked about financing. These are all the things, and Africa needs to get its act together, not only in agriculture, on a lot of other areas or sectors that we engage our international partners with. But agriculture there is huge potential. I served in Madagascar for a couple of years. Madagascar is the biggest producer of vanilla in the world. But there's no processing of vanilla in Madagascar. The Belgians come, and the French come, and all this stuff goes there, and it's turned into chocolates, and Coca-Cola buys it for Coca-Cola. That's a simple example, but we need an African revolution in agriculture, modernization, increased production, and we need to work with all our international partners to make that possible. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to invite everyone here. Please go ahead.
Guys, no problem. Kenny Mobasa. I come from a small NGO called IDISA, International Disarmament Initiative of South Africa. AFCTA, long acronym, WTO, ATT, Arms Trade Treaty. Did any of you or any of the big minds try to harmonize on synthesize their synergies or their correlations? Because these are the mega treaties that affect us in Africa. Just the last one quickly, which I think is what I call the original sin for Africa, the asymmetrical conceptualization of Africa, which is, I don't know, plus minus 50-something countries. So China versus South Africa, India, South Africa, Europe, South Africa, UK, South Africa. That framing, that conceptualization of Africa as homogeneous or at least monolithic kind of entity, don't you think that is really the original sin? It's a mistake that really hinders Africa's progress as well. Thank you.
I wonder if I could direct that to Ambassador Grobler, and maybe add, a slight detail to that, like because obviously Africa has regional and kind of continental bodies in place. What are some of the factors that are holding back a larger role for those bodies in actually facilitating a better kind of position for Africa in these issues?
Oh, thank you. That's an interesting question. The problem is, obviously, you take a country like China, the France, you have interaction between Europe and Africa through the European Union. You have interaction between Africa and Japan through TICAD. And so it goes on. And at these annual summits, like the one that's coming up with Russia, and we have regularly with our major international partners, is actually, in a certain sense, run by the African Union. The African Union, they, in advance of these meetings, summits, there are umpteenth meetings where they discuss strategy, where they discuss what do we want from Japan, what do we want from. My view is that, and a lot of people who've been involved in this, including at Durka, are saying it's not strategic enough, it's not focused enough. And that we should, as I said about the agricultural thing, is to say to them, look, in our agreement or in our communique, we're going to clearly spell out where we want to be in a year or 2 or 3. Now, that's on an AU level. Obviously, of course, on a continental level, all these countries have bilateral relations. And a lot of the things that are happening on bilateral level doesn't always correspond with what, let's say, the chiefs in Addis Ababa want. So that's complex. But I know from China, there were a lot of companies, and there were a lot of projects which many of your, and sometimes some of your smaller African countries, your poorer African countries, who feel we're missing out in this big AU FOCAC meetings. We talking directly to the Chinese, and a lot of them they're talking to the French, they talk to the Americans. And that, in a certain sense, what creates confusion, and of course helps in many cases, but it creates confusion, and it's not always aligned with what the AU wants. So that's, to have 54 countries around the table to decide on what we want from Japan, what we want from China, is not simple. But we need to work on that. I just believe that as Africa, the AU is responsible, and then we're heading towards the Africa Agenda 2063, that there should be a degree of consultation, coordination, and to decide what do we want for our continent. But that doesn't detract. I mean, as I said, that doesn't mean that your smaller countries or individual countries, and all of them do that, have bilateral relations with these major partners. But it's complicated.
I just want to add to what the ambassador said, and clearly, when we're talking about trade and investment in Africa, we don't have a unitary regulatory framework. We have the AU, we have the AU Commission, but it's not the European Union Commission or the European Commission. And so clearly these continental platforms like FOCAC, I think, is a platform for developing a framework. But the specificities, in the absence of integrated regional economic communities or a fully implemented African continental free trade area, still lie then with the individual countries in terms of how you then take that, the framework agreement or the framework commitments forward in terms of your specific requirements. And I think what is important here to emphasize, and it's come up also in conversations we've had in various continental platforms, including most notably, I think, the African Union Development Agency, is that making, I think South Africa probably more than others is there is I think there is a sufficient scientific knowledge base, number crunching, policy sort of reflection, think tanks and government departments, etc., to be able to make certain decisions or to put certain things on the table that are seen to be advantageous depending on what you want to achieve. That is not always many other African countries don't necessarily always have that foundation and that base. And I think and so when they engage, I think, in conversations, they're not necessarily there with all the facts, because sometimes the facts are not there. They haven't been assessed. So I think that dimension is important. Is how do you build an evidence base for making economic, trade, investment decisions that are in your interest, that help you to get to that mutual benefit that Jean-Claude was talking about, rather than what did he call it, the comparative benefit or the relative gain situation. And certainly organizations like the AU Commission, like AUDA, can help to sort of become clearinghouses or crowd in some of the analysis that is required. But at the end of the day, in the absence of regional economic communities that are fully harmonized on these policies, we end up on the bilateral. So in Madagascar, on vanilla, what are the kinds of policy interventions that the state needs to take, and then also to empower local companies to actually be able to carry it through. I mean, some of the work that Development Reimagined is doing, and some of the points that Yike mentioned now are critical, because even in the South African context, sometimes we sign trade agreements and they don't necessarily filter down to the small and medium enterprises that are in a position to potentially build an export market, but need those, that hips to it, the hips to it, the push, and to help. They need people to help them connect the dots in terms of how you enter these markets. And I think these are some of the points. Maybe they're not entirely practical. I'm not a business person, but I think these are some of the issues that when we talk about how we optimize relations with China, and that it's not a monolithic approach, we can't get away from. Those are things we need to, as policymakers, as researchers, to sort of have in mind and to see what we can do about.
To just invite anyone from the floor, would like to, go ahead. Yeah, I think it's
So I think there might be some questions online.
yes. While the mic is sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. While the mic, just quickly, I wanted to add that on this question of the logistics and the just so many countries and so on, at least in the Hunan end, going back to Hunan, that digital services hub is designed exactly for that. It offers translation of websites, French, Portuguese, English, Swahili, and it offers a way and advice to Chinese companies to how do you work across countries in Africa, given these logistical differences, given these communications technologies and so on. It's precisely for that reason, to support companies to work across different economies, across different languages within the kind of broader continental market. So I'm not saying you can easily have an equivalent at the other end. That's easier to centralize. But they are aware of that, and they have these efforts to overcome them. And the only other thing, I presently live in Berlin, and if you think the EU doesn't have its own bilateral, multilateral issues with China, even with all those resources, like they still have a lot of coordination issues and a lot of center periphery issues. So it's not something that there's no miracle goalpost, but obviously there's a lot of improvements.
It's the human condition.
Go ahead.
Hello. Yeah. Sinless Van, I'm from the Norwegian Embassy. I just want to kind of push more on the topic that Professor Maswana highlighted. And I mean, for China, natural resource access is a key priority, is a national security concern, and its manufacturing and industrial sectors are incredibly over leveraged, and they have massive amounts of overproduction. And so I just want to ask how that development, infrastructure, regional development in Africa can develop with China, when China probably is not willing to give up that infrastructure development or material development itself to African countries.
Jean-Claude, go ahead.
Thank you for the question. Allow me to disagree with that reading. I don't think, I might be wrong, but I have no evidence to believe that China is not willing to give anything to Africa, simply based on Chinese own experience. Perhaps they don't believe that they should give any advantage to Africa because nobody, not the Japanese or the Korean or United States, gave China anything to trigger its own development. So in some way, we should not expect China really to be giving us, to be setting up so many initiatives. And I used to describe the African attitude, including myself, so I'm not putting myself on a separate group. So our thinking for decades has been configured in such a way that I will compare with the wedding proposal. In many society, the man will be thinking about the date, the present, the ring, and the scenario to surprise the lady whose only expectation is that she will accept. And then everything up to the proposal, the guy will be talking with friends, bringing the cameraman to hide behind the tree. And then the lady, we expect just the lady to say yes and to be happy following the proposal. So our mindset, when I look at our interaction as Africans, scholars or policymakers, most of the time is already framed that way. We are waiting for China to set up FOCA. Our leaders are really just happy to go. And I'm sorry for the ambassadors. Our ambassadors are responding present to those meetings. But this is a bilateral relationship. We should be consistent. States have only interest. China, in good faith, is moving step by step, protecting its own interests. And then that's a good thing. But if we are not, we are waiting for the wedding rings. We are waiting for the China to decide when China is going to propose. Then if it's lasting too long, we complain that China is not proposing. We are ready for when China is not proposing. So I don't blame China at all. Nowadays, knowing what we have known after 28 years as adults, researchers based in Asia, I came to believe that in good faith, China has been avoiding repeating exactly what African countries have been blaming Europeans. So China has been, to some extent, avoiding that. But because of political pressure, little by little, China is now moving into repeating some of the mistakes that Europe did. And then we are still waiting. It should not be like that. There are so many initiatives we should take in Asia, in developing Asia. There is no equivalent for big summits such as FOCAP. China deals with Asian countries mostly on one-to-one basis. Why do we have it in Africa? Because our expectations are different than developing Asian expectations. China should deal with African countries based on one-to-one bilateral rather than the collective, because South Africa is a different economy than Nigeria. And the analysis I described, because we didn't have time, sorry, Coben, allow me to just a couple of minutes. We didn't have time to get into more details. If you include South Africa in Africa, you have a completely different configuration than if you exclude South Africa. Which means if you exclude countries such as Morocco or Egypt, you get a different configuration. Mostly macroeconomists, we use econometrics a lot. Whenever we exclude these two countries or regions, so Maghreb and South Africa and Mauritius, the econometric, the empirical result that you get will be different, the magnitude of the coefficients, and sometimes even the significance of the coefficient will be different, because these are different kind of economies. South Africa can trade with China at mostly equal basis, because South Africa has one of the most, or I will say the advanced industrial basis. But if you include South Africa, Malawi, you have a summit. What do we expect as a dialogue? So heterogeneity is so wide that it doesn't make sense, or it's not really relevant to either conduct analysis by framing all Africa as homogeneous, as somebody else pointed out. And then in terms of the practical negotiation, there could be some kind of dialogue that can happen between Africa and China. But much of the development discussions need to be taken place on bilateral basis, because South Africa and Malawi, South Africa and the DRC, I don't see this as two economies that I can even compare, especially from macroeconomic point of view. They are not anywhere close. They are not. Thank you.
Stephen, go ahead.
It seems to me from the Chinese perspective, working with Africa, working with African countries, there seems to be two main drivers, right? Firstly, there's the political. So if you're Beijing, if you're China, the West is, if you like, an existential threat. I mean, Africa traditionally has been friendly towards China. I mean, when Beijing got its UN Security Council seat back in 1971, it was on back of African votes. So from a Chinese perspective, political support from African countries, and there's so many of them, it's quite a big voting bloc. So politically, it makes sense for China to build good relationships with African countries. So that's probably the most important driver of the China-Africa relationship. The second driver is commercial, right? So there's hundreds and tens of thousands of private Chinese businesses. So you have Chinese SOEs who's doing various projects that's purely for political reasons, right? It's a project. However, vast majority of projects or Chinese investments are for profit, right? Whether it's an investment in a brickyard in Zambia or buying chrome from Zimbabwe, these are private enterprises looking for an opportunity, right? And so and I suppose the third point I'm trying to make is that these are Chinese businesses running around Africa doing their thing, driven by the invisible hand, if you will. So that's the point I'm trying to make. I don't think Beijing, politically it's important that it has good relationships with Africa. Well, I suppose another point is, as China faces threats from the West, it needs to diversify. It needs to find iron ore from places other than Australia, I suppose, just to spread your bet a bit, right? It needs to find soybeans places other than the US. So these are different drivers of the relationship. And it seems to me it's reasonable for China and African countries to continue to try and get a win-win situation out of the whole thing.
There's a question on the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you. Mine's a quick one. My name is Kule from the Anglo-American Group. We know, especially out of the EU, you have the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so I guess the quick question is really if we're seeing a similar thing coming out of China, precisely that the country in its national determined contributions has a target to decarbonize. And then there was also mention around value add in terms of the African perspective. And so my question is also whether that type of mechanism, especially as it come out of China, can also encourage green industrialization, for example. So obviously in South Africa, our renewable energy sector is driven by our energy crisis, but outside of that, it's also driven by the fact that our customers need a product that has less emissions from it, and moving away from thermal coal certainly helps. So just like to get some thinking around that, especially from the Chinese perspective. Thanks.
Ika, would you be able to tackle that question? So, issues of decarbonization in relation to trade and what kind of measures China is putting in place around that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And Development Reimagined also did publish a report to kind of analysis or to study China-Africa relationship on climate change cooperation, and that is working with Africa Climate Foundation. And I think definitely there's kind of a big trend that we have seen that Chinese strongly interest in investing in renewable energy sector in Africa. So not only hydropower, like constructing hydropower dam, like the projects, and also maybe move to the also smaller size like solar panels, wind projects, and also maybe even like agricultural one linking to the renewable energy, etc. And I think definitely this can be also linking to, I think it's kind of several years ago, like China does not build any coal projects overseas. And like beside that, China have kind of an increasing interest in Africa's renewable energy sector. I think someone might have mentioned that this one reason may be like renewable energy manufacturing. China is kind of like very so many people, like so many companies, is kind of have a very high like demand, and also have a huge supplier from the supplier side. So some of the countries that want to expand their like market, so they choose Africa as a destination. And I think I also attend like the solar panel like webinar or like exhibition in end of June in Shanghai, with kind of the gathering a lot of companies in China, like focusing on solar panel, also like also renewable energy sectors. And what really surprised me that already some of the enterprises have mentioned that they are expanding their kind of like market to Africa. And so this also linking to what we have been working, like most recently, another climate project to looking at like the manufacturing capacity in Africa to see if it's a good thing and if it is feasible. And also it's quite an important thing in Africa to see increasing its manufacturing capacity of environmental goods. I think this is all kind of thing kind of be related. So we have seen a lot of Chinese company already have their solar projects, such as in Morocco, in Egypt, but when I like visit and visiting some of the enterprises in China and have kind of a manufactured like solar panels, a a limitation they mentioned that is still kind of like a skill set in Africa size. So it's kind of a question asked whether they have the plan to move their factories to Africa instead of just export the panels from China, which is a manufactured good. So I think they mentioned like the skill is kind of the limitation, and also kind of the ability to have like manufacture kind of the high skill, more advanced technology products is also a limitation. So that's why at this moment, based on our research, like mostly it's still kind of the Chinese company manufactured solar panels and then export to Africa country and to have the solar panel projects such of thing. But what we as a DR like believe that, so maybe it's kind of the rethinking about this whole process. So instead of maybe just exporting from China, we also thinking it's quite important to kind of increase the local manufacturing capacity, like the industrialization. So maybe this can be linking to Chinese special economic zones in Africa, and how like Chinese companies can fit into and close these barriers related to financial like gaps, and also maybe to increase help to capacity building and also technology transfer in the renewable energy sectors. Thanks.
I'd like to touch on geopolitics for a moment. Helena Dogo is in the online questions. She asked the question, you know, African countries are heading to speak with Russia soon. And she's not seeing any kind of like coherent kind of agenda, you know, emerging about what these countries actually want from Russia or what they want from China. And Ambassador Kobler, I was wondering, in a moment where the very existence of ties with certain global powers are raising suspicions among other global powers, you know, and we have the legislation going through in the US about punishing African countries for too much engagement with Russia, and there's a lot of pressure also within the US around decoupling and so on. What is the space for African countries to make to explore what they actually want from these different powers, and to which extent do you see this kind of current geopolitical moment kind of constraining Africa's trade and development options?
I think that the general sense of Africa on the war in Ukraine is one that, of course, as a result of all the geopolitical developments around that, is now threatening to force Africa and the developing world to take sides. And particularly Africa, we've gone through a previous Cold War, which we don't want to see a repetition of. Africa, strictly speaking, does not want to be caught up in having to take sides in this war. Unfortunately, as a result of, that a lot of issues that happened, particularly as far as South Africa is concerned, South Africa's position as a non-aligned country is now being seen as actually pro-Russian and non-aligned. And that also maybe applied to a few other countries. But what Africa would not want to see, as I want to repeat, we do not want to be caught up in another Cold War situation where we, to the detriment of our relations and our economies, have to decide, we want, and I mentioned it earlier on, what Africa would like to see is, and we're talking about China today, but it is critical for Africa and I talked about that we're standing on the cusp of major developments in this country on the continent for a number of reasons, is that we want to see, we need to work with all our international partners. And that's one of the reasons we don't want to be caught up in a new Cold War. We want to engage the US. We're engaging the EU. We're doing that. That in essence is that we do not want to be caught up in another Cold War. And of course, what is now already happening, not only for South Africa, but for Africa, is that Africa is experiencing as a result of the war in the Ukraine, and which led to the peace initiative by Africa. And this thing, there was a lot of cynicism and there was a lot of criticism, but in essence, it was Africa stood up and said, look, we want to see peace. And it's always been, you go back as far as South Africa is concerned, what Nelson Mandela said in 1994 and prior to that, in finding peaceful solutions and negotiated solutions for it's always been part of South Africa's foreign policy consistently. So what we saw with that initiative was Africa saying, we want to solve this problem. We want to listen to both sides. We want to find a negotiated solution because we don't want to be caught up in, as I said, a Cold War.
To add from several of the points, about 6 weeks ago, I was at a Belt and Road conference in Chongqing, and there was a senior former Indonesian politician speaking, and he said with almost a grin in his speech, whoever wants to win between America and China in terms of Indonesia's use of technology should hand us the technology. Like, if you don't give it to us, we'll bargain or we'll go wherever. Like, really, so all these countries are trying, and I guess it depends. Can you use that? How do you use that fragmentation for your advantage? And the kind of confident smile this Indonesian guy had when he said that left me with the impression that they're working on maximizing that division for their interests. And then I wanted to add a point, and it actually feeds into that also on the green industrialization and even having the energy availability in order to have this industrialization. You can't be competitive, you can't have big industry unless you have reliable energy. And in terms of like in Congo, where Jean-Claude is from, there's a lot of talk about building some dream long-term hydro project, and it's actually now progressing partly through what might be a partnership between Congo, Australian mining, and China. And so, so there's a guy in Australia called Andrew Forrest, and he runs a company called Fortescue, which has increasing interests. And there seems to be but despite Australia-China tensions, he sells most of his iron ore to China. So he has also good ties with China. So if that you unlock that three-way, then you get the kind of best of all worlds, where you get the hydro-powered industrialization, and then theoretically you can add the value to all those minerals. And if that happens, that is a partner. It's not China, it's China with Australia, with Congo. I don't know the details, but at least you see that potential if it goes forward. There's so many pieces. And just finally on these trade logistics, I think any month now, there's a big China, it's called the East Africa Logistics Company or Center or something, and it's opening outside Dar es Salaam. So a lot of these trade logistics and so on, from data to language to distribution across the East Africa end, will start to filter out from this hub in Dar es Salaam to all the surrounding landlocked countries. So there is a lot going on. It's just not It's not necessarily common knowledge. So I would encourage everyone to read Cobus's briefing on what China's like. To get this cross-country sense and make informed decisions, you really have to see what's going on. And that East Africa Logistics Company, probably by next year, will start to be a game change for China-fed trade logistics in East Africa. And then if you ever get that Congo Dam, then you get all those dots connecting. So there are things. And that's with Australia, not against Australia. In that sense, it's like a three-way thing.
Just to pick up on the geopolitical thing and the question and the issue here about it being an opportunity, and reflecting on what Lauren said about the Indonesian colleague. I think this is also an opportunity. Well, this is it's a tipping point. What did you call it? It's a particular sort of start of a new era. We're in a transition where I think also a lot of the paradigms that have defined much of the economics, the technology, etc., also have to be rethought. And I think from an African perspective, it's important for us to consider issues around technology and intellectual property rights and cooperation on or how one cooperates, how one, particularly in the context of having to make the transition, and the transition having to be just. And technology being a pivot around which that can happen. The same around debt. We need to rethink, and Yike referred to it, and Development Reimagined has done some great work in that regard. We need to rethink how we understand debt and sustainability in the context of Agenda 2030. And these discussions are happening, but I think from an African perspective, if we're talking about this through the prism of African agency, we need to really sort of ramp up our thinking about what kind of global system, global framework do we want to see emerge out of this transition period. We all want an order that has rules. The rules, not all the rules that we have currently need to be thrown out, but certainly some rules need to be reformed. And I think we need to be thinking about what we want to put on that table. So, and we need to think about the values that underpin that, I think. And that's critical. And so there's an opportunity here for Africa to really amplify its voice and its voices, because there isn't just one African voice, and that's not a problem. But certainly to take advantage of it. So it doesn't mean we need to ramp up our knowledge coordination and cooperation and development to be able to really put ourselves at the front there in terms of what we want to change. In the same way that, on the African Peace Mission, we said, well, we're going to undertake it. It shouldn't be the case that, the global north always sends peace missions to Africa. We're going to send a peace mission the other way around. So I think it's that paradigm shift.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our session. Any final questions? Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm conscious we don't have much time, so I'll keep my my question really brief. My name's Lucinda from the British High Commission. In a number of the presentations, South Africa has been labelled as an outlier in some of this big picture stuff that we've covered, and I completely agree. So my question really is zooming into South Africa and taking advantage of some of the way the conversation has moved. What does the future look like for South Africa China trade? It's not a criticism, but some analysts will say that the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, people got very excited about it here in 2015, and it's less spoken about now. So what does South Africa China trade look like? And are there any comparatives on the continent, given the unique situation that South Africa's economy is at vis-a-vis China trade? Are there other nations moving in a similar place to South Africa? Hopefully that makes sense. Thank you.
Who would like to jump in? I wonder if Stephen, would you like to kick off just with a few thoughts on South Africa's particular position, and then in any of the other guests, feel free to jump in.
So I'll try and put a 1P. So my criticism I've long held the criticism that South Africa has not fully taken advantage of the Belt and Road Initiative. I've always felt, and because I'm sort of involved in some of the projects and trying to get them sorted out, and South Africa's own internal policy, etc., has meant that South Africa has not really received the huge amount of Belt and Road Initiative funding, right? So, and now the Belt and Road Initiative, it seems to me, has been scaled back quite a bit. So that's actually my criticism. So as far as where this relationship is going, it seems to be, I don't have all the answers, but it seems to be progressing okay. I mean, as everybody here knows, the relationship between the ANC and the Chinese Communist Party is quite good. Would that shift with South Africa perhaps going to the elections next year? I don't think so. It seems to me that it's on pretty solid foundation. Yeah, so I don't have all the. Yeah, so I don't have all the answers here. It seems to me South Africa is almost the foundation for China's Africa policy. It's part of BRICS. If you spend some time in Johannesburg, the vast majority of Chinese SOEs have a base in the Africa base is here. You just look at all the financial institutions, China Communication Bank, ICBC, obviously almost 25% in a bank. But the major Chinese financial institutions, Sinosure is in South Africa. So from a Chinese perspective, South Africa is quite a key piece of the puzzle. So I don't particularly see any big hiccups in the relationship as far as I can tell. And as Laura has mentioned, things are opening up. Things like fruit, wine, etc. So trade is gradually opening up. So yeah, so that's my 2 cents. I think the relationship is stable. It's quite foundational, and it will probably improve. To be honest, there will be more trade. So I'll stop there. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't deeply follow China, South Africa, but a while ago I wrote a paper on what China's doing in Zimbabwe, and there's quite a huge amount of value added going on in some minerals area, minerals processing. An iron ore deposit will be developed into Africa's largest steel plant that comes online next year, I would think. So if that succeeds and does become Africa's largest steel plant, that obviously might challenge South Africa's place in steel and add a competitive angle to the steel industry in South Africa. And then I think there's chrome and there's all sorts of value added potentials going on in minerals, which if they succeed over the next 5 years might change the dynamic of South Africa's own steel and mineral sector, both absolutely and relatively within Africa and outside of Africa.
Go ahead.
Now, I just, in conclusion, would like to say that I have been following the discussion in the media by political parties and so on South Africa's foreign policy. I was in the Foreign Service 40 years and I left in 2017. And that since 1994, South Africa's foreign policy has actually not changed. I'm not talking about what happened now around Russia and Ukraine and the perception of South Africa's policy of non-aligned actually being pro-Russia. I'm talking about, and if you look, and I did it the other day, I wrote an article or two on that, on South Africa's foreign policy since 1994, nothing has changed. If you look at what the policy priorities looked like under President Mandela, and you look at Foreign Affairs Dirko's policy now, it's exactly the same. Africa, we're part of Africa. Secondly, we need to have good relations and friendly relations and constructive relations with all our diplomatic partners. Thirdly, we need to build our relationship with our traditional partners, the EU, America. The fourth one is we need to expand our relations with the South-South, Global South. The fifth one is a very strong commitment to multilateralism with the UN at its core. Those are in essence what South Africa stood from 1994. And we have in fact made great progress in terms of not only, I'm not talking about the last 6 months or the last year, that the relationship, I was involved, I helped to negotiate the EU-South Africa Trade and Development Agreement. Took me to all the great restaurants in Brussels over 2 years. So I saw, and I was in America, I went there many times with President Mbeki. We had a strong dialogue and a strong partnership with the US. We had that with the EU, and I believe it's still there. There are huge irritations, but it's there. But on the other hand, South Africa expanded its relations with China. I mean, we've always had relations with China, and China helped the freedom movements in the 50s and the 60s. We always had good relations with Russia. And what has happened in the meantime, we've expanded our relations with the rest of Asia. ASEAN, we have a very strong relationship and a growing relationship with ASEAN countries. So the bottom line is that there is, I believe, it's my view, that South Africa's policy of a non-aligned approach is the right one. Because as long, and it must be in our national interest, we must work with America, we must work with the European Union, but we must equally work with China and with the South-South countries. So in essence, the non-aligned approach, provided it's implemented and executed in the right manner, is the right policy for South Africa to follow. And you know, talking to political parties here, some of them whom have been very critical of South Africa's involvement with the position on Russia and Ukraine, and it's encouraging to hear that many of them are saying, but that's the only way forward for South Africa. So, and yeah, so that is, it must remain our non-aligned approach, but must be implemented in practice in a manner that doesn't cause all kinds of problems and threats to introduce sanctions and Congress and so forth. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's a great, I think, point to end on. We have come to the end of our session. Sai asked me to just add a few kind of concluding remarks at the end. So just very briefly, my work at the moment focuses a lot on drawing comparisons between Africa's engagement with China and other global South regions' engagement with China. And excuse me, one of the things that one sees is that that there's massive kind of trade diversification going on, you know, around the world. China is strategically avoiding being dependent on anyone for anything, essentially. You know, they're trying to kind of diversify their supplies of all kinds of commodities as broadly as they can. And what you then frequently see in action is the same companies doing very similar kind of projects in South America and in Africa, or in Southeast Asia and in Africa. So, you know, I think what's really important there is for Global South peer learning. You know, the development reimagined is called several times for what they call a borrowers club of information sharing and, you know, kind of co-consulting, co-learning between different borrowers from China. You know, obviously, as debt is a major issue at the moment, I think it's more important than ever to do that. But I think it's also really important to have peer-to-peer learning between policymakers from different global South countries, which I think is already happening to a certain extent. It's been very interesting to see the move from Indonesia to ban the export of raw mineral ore being picked up in Africa very rapidly. You know, that's already happening. But what we also need to twin that with is global South peer learning between actual global South people, and between civil society organizations, between other people that operate from a bottom-up perspective rather than from the policymakers, you know, preferred bottom-down perspective. Because, you know, we recently spoke around this issue of Indonesian the Indonesian law to refine minerals with an Indonesian journalist who made the point that this has been ruinous for communities in you know, kind of environmentally and to a certain extent socially in many parts of Indonesia, and it's not necessarily making the government that much more money. So, you know, so there's the balancing between the kind of orthodoxy of certain, this is the path towards development, this is the path to you, this is how you use your natural resources to trigger development in your country. You know, that peer learning is needed on that scale, but the fallout from those policies, peer learning is needed on that scale as well. So I think that's really important. And I think what also then, just as a final point, one of the points that one of our commenters, Helena Dogo, made was that so frequently in Africa, where you have these kind of massive overarching mechanisms and agreements and kind of plans of action, but those tend to kind of break down on the country to country level, you know, in rivalries between neighboring countries. And she was particularly kind of mentioning the DRC and Rwanda. That's particularly, of course, an extreme version of that situation, but you find that that dynamic all over the continent. And so maybe what another place that we can explore in future conversations is the possibility for coordinated development and trade and industrialization plans between regional neighbors, you know, because one of the things that we've been picking up a lot is African countries, in like each African country having their own national development plan and then ending up offering exactly the same product, exactly the same service, and essentially then undercutting each other, you know, kind of, whereas some form of like more you know, more intuitive coordination between them, you know, may have like led to more synergies. So I think you know, kind of maybe that's that, you know, maybe we can pull this conversation back to the ground level out in Africa and then move from there. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's fantastic to have all of you here. We would like to, you know, SIRE is continually trying to improve their services. They're always trying to kind of coordinate with policymakers and with other stakeholders to try and kind of make their work better and more useful to everyone. So there's an event evaluation form that's been handed out to everyone. So we'd be super grateful if you could just add your impressions in there and any suggestions. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's fantastic to see all of you.